Stop pretending and get up, my husband shouted, shoving his phone camera directly into my face while I lay completely paralyzed on the cold marble driveway. His mother stood behind him, sipping her champagne and complaining that my pathetic cry for attention was ruining her son's birthday party. They laughed together, genuinely amused, convinced I was staging a dramatic scene to steal the spotlight. But as the warm blood pooled beneath my head and my limbs refused to respond to my brain, desperate commands, my eyes locked onto his. He was not just ignoring my pain, he was enjoying it. My name is Madison, 34 years old, and until that precise moment, I thought I had built the perfect life. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a wealth management firm, completely self-made from absolutely nothing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized the person you loved was actually your greatest enemy. I stared up at the darkening sky above our sprawling Connecticut estate, a massive mansion I had purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money just 6 months ago. The grand marble steps leading to the entryway were supposed to be a symbol of my ultimate success. I grew up in a cramped, drafty trailer park where the rent was always late and meals were whatever expired goods we could find at the discount store. I worked 80-hour weeks for over a decade to pull myself out of that crushing poverty, building my financial empire, one demanding client at a time. I bought this house to prove I had finally made it. Instead, those very same luxury steps had just become my executioner block. It was supposed to be a celebration. I had spent weeks carefully planning a lavish 35th birthday party for my husband Bradley. Bradley presented himself to the world as a tech visionary, constantly boasting about his cryptocurrency investments and startup ventures on social media. The reality was far less glamorous. He had not earned a single dime in 3 years. I funded his entire lifestyle, paying for his designer suits, his luxury cars, and his constant need to appear wildly successful to his thousands of internet followers. I was carrying a heavy silver tray of expensive appetizers out to the patio when my heel caught on something unnaturally slick on the top step. There was absolutely no time to catch myself. My feet flew out from under me and I went pitching backward into empty air. The impact was deafening. My neck violently struck the sharp edge of the marble step, sending a sickening crack echoing through my skull. A blinding flash of white light consumed my vision, followed instantly by a wave of physical agony so intense it knocked all the breath from my lungs. I tumbled down the remaining 5 steps like a broken doll, landing in a twisted, unnatural heap on the paved driveway. I waited for the frantic rush of footsteps, the panicked shouts of my husband rushing to my side to help me. Instead, I heard the familiar electronic chime of a video recording starting. Bradley stepped casually into my field of vision, his phone pointed directly at my bleeding face. "Get up, Madison," he sneered, his voice dripping with pure annoyance. "You are not going to ruin my birthday with your dramatic nonsense. Get off the ground right now." I tried to speak, to beg him to call an ambulance, to tell him I could not feel my legs, but my jaw completely refused to open. Panic, cold and sharp, began to spread rapidly through my chest. I sent a desperate internal command to my fingers to twitch, to my arms, to lift, to my knees to bend. Absolutely nothing happened. My body was a heavy, lifeless anchor, completely disconnected from my brain. I was trapped alive inside my own flesh. His mother Beatrice walked over slowly, the ice clinking loudly in her crystal glass. She looked down at me with an expression of utter disgust. She had always hated me. A self-proclaimed suburban aristocrat, Beatrice never let me forget that my wealth could not erase my poor background. She happily spent my money while mocking the hands that earned it. "You can take the girl out of the trailer park, but you cannot teach her class," she scoffed, nudging my motionless shoulder with the tip of her expensive designer shoe. "Look at her, Bradley, lying on the dirt just to pull the attention away from you. She is probably faking a concussion because she could not stand the fact that today is about her husband, not her precious company." I lay there staring up at them, my vision blurring at the edges. Blood was actively dripping down the side of my face, staining the immaculate driveway I paid to have pressure washed every single week. I screamed internally, pleading for anyone to call for medical help. But the loud party raged on in the backyard, the heavy bass of the music easily drowning out the terrible silence of my paralysis. Bradley adjusted his angle, making sure the lighting caught his face perfectly, as he spoke directly to his followers. "Can you believe this, guys?" he said into the camera, putting on his best exasperated husband persona. "My wife literally threw herself down the stairs because I was getting too many birthday gifts today. Classic toxic behavior." He laughed, a genuine amused chuckle that sent terrifying shivers down what was left of my functioning spine. In that horrifying moment of absolute physical vulnerability, the veil was completely lifted from my eyes. For 3 years of marriage, I had convinced myself that Bradley was just misguided, that his financial failures were temporary, that his mother cruelty was just protectiveness. I had poured my hard-earned wealth into keeping him happy, believing he truly loved me. But looking into his eyes as he filmed my broken, bleeding body for internet clout, I finally saw the undeniable truth. He did not just lack empathy. He was entirely devoid of a soul. He was a parasite, and Beatrice was his enabler, both of them happily feeding off my massive success while openly despising the woman who provided it. A warm sensation spread around the back of my head as more blood escaped the deep gash on my skull. My breathing grew dangerously shallow. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that they were going to let me die right here on the driveway if it meant they could inherit my company and my estate. They were waiting for me to expire, completely unaware that my mind was razor-sharp, recording every word, every laugh, every cruel gesture. They thought I was finished. But they had vastly underestimated the survival instincts of a woman who had fought her way up from the absolute bottom. If I survived this dark night, I was going to destroy them both. The harsh glare of the patio lights illuminated the ever-growing pool of blood beneath my shattered head. Bradley was still holding his phone steady, capturing what he believed was my ultimate humiliation. He adjusted his stance to get a better angle of my motionless body against the expensive landscaping. Beatrice took another casual sip of her champagne, completely unfazed by the gruesome scene unfolding at her designer shoes. They thought they had all the time in the world to let me bleed out on the cold stone. They were entirely convinced they had executed the perfect plan to get rid of me and inherit my wealth. They were wrong. The heavy wooden gate leading to the backyard swung open with a loud thud. A party guest named Kevin walked around the corner of the house carrying a plate of catered food from the kitchen. He stopped dead in his tracks. The ceramic plate slipped from his hands, shattering violently against the pavement. He screamed my name, his voice slicing straight through the heavy bass of the party music. He sprinted toward me, completely ignoring the angry glare my husband shot in his direction. Bradley immediately lowered his phone, his face twisting in intense irritation. "Relax, Kevin," he groaned, rolling his eyes dramatically. "She is just putting on a show because she drank too much and wants to ruin my birthday dinner. Give her a minute and she will magically recover from her little tantrum." But Kevin ignored him completely. He took one look at the unnatural angle of my neck and the massive amount of dark blood soaking into the stone. He pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling hands and dialed emergency services. Bradley stepped forward, reaching out to grab Kevin by the arm, demanding he hang up the phone immediately. Beatrice hissed at the guest, insisting he was overreacting to a spoiled woman throwing a massive pity party. Kevin shoved Bradley away with brutal force and yelled our address to the emergency dispatcher. I lay trapped inside my unresponsive shell, my eyes tracking the dark sky as the distant wail of sirens finally pierced the suburban quiet. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the pristine facade of my mansion. An ambulance screeched to a halt at the edge of the driveway. Paramedic Ramirez leapt from the passenger side before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. She grabbed her heavy trauma bag and sprinted toward my motionless body. She was a seasoned professional, her eyes instantly scanning the severe trauma zone. But before she could even kneel beside me, Beatrice purposefully stepped directly into her path, crossing her arms defensively to block the medical equipment. "You are wasting your time, honey," Beatrice scoffed, looking down her nose at the paramedic. "She is heavily intoxicated and throwing a massive fit for attention. Just drag her inside so my son can go back to enjoying his celebration." "Do not make a huge scene out of a simple drunken stumble." Paramedic Ramirez did not even blink. She used her shoulder to forcefully shove Beatrice aside completely, ignoring the older woman and her indignant gasp. "Step back immediately, or I will have you arrested for obstructing emergency medical personnel." Ramirez barked, her voice carrying absolute authority. Beatrice stumbled backward, her face turning crimson with pure rage, while Bradley stood silently in the background, his jaw tightly clenched. Ramirez dropped to her knees beside my head. She snapped on her blue latex gloves and carefully secured my neck to prevent any further movement. "Madison, can you hear me?" she asked clearly and loudly. "Blink twice if you can hear my voice." I summoned every ounce of energy I possessed and blinked my eyes twice. "Okay, Madison. I am right here," Ramirez said, her professional tone offering the first sliver of comfort I had felt all night. "I am going to check your vitals and your mobility. Stay exactly as you are. Do not try to speak." She quickly moved her hands down my body, checking my spine and my extremities. I felt absolutely nothing. It was as if she was touching a phantom limb. Ramirez pulled a small, sharp medical pin from her pocket. "I need to test your pain response and your reflexes, Madison," she explained calmly. She took off my right shoe and dragged the sharp tip of the pin firmly across the sole of my bare foot. Zero response. My foot did not twitch. My toes did not curl. My leg remained completely dead against the cold pavement. Ramirez tried the left foot. She pressed the pin harder, dragging it sharply across the sensitive arch. Still absolutely nothing. No reflex, no flinch. Total paralysis. The color instantly drained from paramedic Ramirez's face. She looked up at my eyes, reading the sheer terror trapped behind my pupils. Her training kicked in immediately. She realized this was a catastrophic spinal cord injury. She stood up abruptly to grab the rigid backboard from the ambulance, moving with intense, calculated urgency. As Ramirez stepped onto the top marble stair to retrieve her equipment, her heavy-duty work boots suddenly lost traction. She slipped slightly, catching her balance on the iron railing just in time. She frowned, looking down at the pristine stone surface. The stairs were perfectly dry. There was no rain, no spilled drinks, no mud. Ramirez crouched down, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the exact spot where my foot had slipped. She pressed her gloved fingers against the marble edge and rubbed them together. I watched her face transform from focused medical concern to absolute chilling realization. She stood up slowly, staring directly at the thick, unnatural layer of slippery industrial-grade wax that had been meticulously applied to the very edge of the top step. It was completely invisible to the naked eye, but lethally slick to any shoe. She looked at the wax, then looked down at the horrifying angle of my broken body, and finally shifted her hard gaze to Bradley, who was still holding his phone. Ramirez did not confront him. She did not ask a single question. She backed away from the steps very slowly, keeping her eyes locked firmly on my husband. She reached for the heavy radio clipped to her shoulder harness. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need immediate police backup at my location. Send multiple units. I have a critical trauma patient with complete spinal paralysis, and I have a highly suspicious scene, possible foul play. Repeat, expedite law enforcement to this address immediately." The words echoed loudly across the quiet suburban driveway. Possible foul play. The transformation in Bradley was instantaneous and absolutely sickening to witness. The moment he heard the paramedic call for police backup, the annoyed, mocking husband vanished entirely. He dropped his phone onto the grass as if it burned him. He fell to his knees on the hard pavement, grabbing his hair and letting out a loud, theatrical wail of pure devastation. "Oh my God! My wife!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with manufactured panic as he tried to crawl toward me. Please save her. Please tell me she is going to be okay. I cannot lose her. What happened? She just slipped. It was an accident. Please help my beautiful wife. He was sobbing hysterically, burying his face in his hands, playing the role of the traumatized, heartbroken spouse to absolute perfection. Beatrice immediately joined the performance, dropping her champagne glass and clutching her chest as if she might faint from the shock of the tragedy. But I lay there in my own blood, trapped in a paralyzed shell, completely unable to expose their deadly charade. I watched the flashing lights of the approaching police cruisers illuminate Bradley and his fake tears, knowing he had carefully orchestrated my murder, and now he was directing his own twisted rescue scene. The chaotic symphony of the emergency room assaulted my senses the moment the ambulance doors swung open. Fluorescent lights passed overhead in a blinding rhythmic blur as a team of trauma nurses rushed my stretcher through the sliding glass doors. I could hear the frantic squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum and the urgent shouting of medical codes. I was a prisoner trapped behind my own eyes. I could feel the rough texture of the cervical collar biting harshly into my jaw, but below my neck, a terrifying void remained. Bradley was running right alongside my stretcher, his hands dramatically clutching his head. He was sobbing loudly, begging the nurses to save his beautiful wife. His performance was truly Oscar-worthy. Just minutes ago, he had been laughing at my broken body on the driveway. Now he was the picture of a devastated husband facing the ultimate tragedy. A tall doctor with silver hair and a stern expression took charge of the trauma bay. His name badge read, Dr. Mitchell. He moved with practiced efficiency, shining a harsh penlight into my pupils and barking orders to the nursing staff. We need an immediate scan of her head and a full spinal magnetic resonance imaging test, he commanded, his voice slicing through the noise. Get neurology down here right now. She has zero motor function in her upper and lower extremities. Bradley hovered near the doorway of the trauma bay, wiping non-existent tears from his cheeks. Beatrice stood right behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her expensive cashmere wrap. She looked incredibly annoyed, as if my near-fatal injury was a personal inconvenience to her evening plans. The next 2 hours were a terrifying blur of cold machines and sterile environments. They slid my paralyzed body into the loud, claustrophobic tunnel of the imaging machine. The rhythmic banging of the magnetic coils echoed around my trapped form. I focused all my remaining mental energy on trying to move a single toe, a single finger, anything to prove I was still alive inside this useless shell. Nothing worked. The terrifying disconnect between my brain and my nerves was absolute. When they finally wheeled me back into the private emergency suite, Dr. Mitchell was waiting with a grim expression on his face. He held a glowing tablet displaying the intricate scans of my spine. Bradley and Beatrice pushed their way into the small room, eager to hear the final verdict. Dr. Mitchell looked directly at Bradley. Your wife has suffered a massive trauma to her cervical spine, he explained, pointing to the glowing screen. The brutal impact caused severe swelling around the spinal cord. She is currently experiencing a critical medical condition known as spinal shock. Bradley wiped his eyes, playing the fool perfectly. What does that mean exactly? He asked, his voice shaking. Is she going to be paralyzed forever? Dr. Mitchell sighed, lowering the tablet. Spinal shock is a state of transient physiological reflex depression of cord function below the level of injury. In simple terms, her entire nervous system has shut down due to the extreme trauma. She is completely paralyzed from the neck down. We cannot predict the permanence of this paralysis until the initial swelling goes down. It could take days, weeks, or it could be a permanent condition. Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic scoff that completely shattered the somber atmosphere of the emergency room. She pushed past Bradley and marched right up to Dr. Mitchell. Permanent or not, we are not keeping her in this ridiculously expensive hospital, Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. Do you have any idea how much a private room and round-the-clock care costs in a facility like this? It is absolute robbery. She is just lying there doing nothing anyway. We will take her back to her house immediately. She has a massive mansion with plenty of empty bedrooms. She can recover just fine in her own bed, without us paying a fortune for your useless machines. I screamed silently in my mind. Taking me back to that isolated mansion while I was completely paralyzed was an absolute death sentence. Bradley and Beatrice would have total control over my care, my medication, and my life. They would easily find a way to finish the job they started on the driveway. A pillow over the face in the middle of the night, a missed dose of crucial medication, a tragic choking accident. Nobody would ever know the truth. Bradley nodded in agreement with his mother, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. My mother is right, doctor. My wife would hate being trapped in a cold, sterile hospital room. She built a beautiful home, and she would want to be there. I can hire a cheap daytime nurse to check on her. We just want to bring her home where she belongs, so we can manage the costs. Dr. Mitchell looked at Beatrice and Bradley as if they had both lost their minds. He crossed his arms, his posture instantly turning hostile. Absolutely not. He stated, his voice ringing with undeniable finality. Your wife is in critical condition. She requires constant monitoring of her autonomic nervous system, continuous blood pressure management, and specialized respiratory observation. Moving a patient in the acute phase of spinal shock is not only medically negligent, it is a direct threat to her life. She is not leaving this hospital under any circumstances. Beatrice's face turned a violent shade of red. She pointed a manicured finger at the doctor. You cannot hold her hostage here just to rack up a massive medical bill. I know exactly how you doctors operate. You see a wealthy patient, and you see dollar signs. But let me tell you something about this girl. She grew up in a filthy trailer park eating out of discount cans. She is much tougher than she looks. She does not need your fancy intensive care unit. I demand you process her discharge papers right now. My son is her husband, and he has the legal right to decide her medical care. Dr. Mitchell did not back down a single inch. He stepped closer to Beatrice, towering over her, with icy professional authority. As the attending physician, I have the legal obligation to act in the best interest of the patient, he countered sharply. Discharging a paralyzed trauma patient against medical advice requires a court order which you will never get tonight. Furthermore, given the highly suspicious nature of her fall and the ongoing police investigation initiated by the paramedics at the scene, nobody is taking this patient anywhere. She stays right here, under 24-hour hospital security. I lay frozen on the hospital bed, unable to smile, unable to cheer, but my heart sang a victorious melody. Beatrice's mouth dropped open in pure shock. Bradley's face went completely pale, his fake tears instantly vanishing. Their perfect plan to drag my helpless body back to that isolated mansion to quietly finish their murderous plot had just been utterly destroyed by strict hospital protocol. They were trapped here under the watchful eyes of doctors, nurses, and the police, and I was finally safe enough to begin planning my revenge. The heavy sliding glass door of the private intensive care room clicked shut, sealing me inside a sterile glass box. Dr. Mitchell and his team of nurses finally retreated to the central nurses' station to process my extensive admission paperwork and coordinate with the local police department. The sudden absence of medical personnel left a thick, suffocating tension hanging in the sterilized air. The only sound remaining was the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor recording my vital signs and the quiet hiss of the supplemental oxygen flowing into my nose. I lay completely immobilized on the stiff hospital mattress. My eyes were fixed forward, staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. The medical staff assumed the catastrophic trauma and the heavy doses of pain medication had rendered me unconscious. They were entirely wrong. My physical body was an unresponsive tomb, but my mind was operating with terrifying razor-sharp clarity. Every single auditory nerve was firing at maximum capacity, capturing the faintest rustle of fabric and the softest intake of breath. As soon as the coast was clear, the suffocating facade of the grieving family instantly evaporated. The loud theatrical sobbing abruptly ceased. Bradley let out a harsh, frustrated breath, running his hands roughly through his perfectly styled hair. He grabbed his mother by the elbow and aggressively yanked her away from my bedside, dragging her into the darkest corner of the spacious hospital room. They moved out of my direct line of sight, but the acoustics of the enclosed suite carried their hushed, vicious whispers straight to my ears. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed fury. She smacked his hand away from her arm. "You hit her way too hard, you absolute idiot. I told you to make it look like a simple, unfortunate trip on the stairs. You nearly decapitated her. Did you see the way that paramedic looked at the marble? She practically dusted the stone for fingerprints. You left a trail of suspicion a mile wide, and now we have the local police department sniffing around my property." Bradley scoffed, completely devoid of any remorse for the brutal violence he had just inflicted upon his wife. "Lower your voice," he snapped back, his tone dripping with arrogant condescension. "It had to look realistic, Mother. If she just bumped her head, she would have woken up and walked away with a minor headache. I needed her entirely incapacitated. I needed her brain completely scrambled so she could not utter a single word to the authorities. The wax I applied to the marble edge was completely untraceable. By the time the police actually get a warrant to inspect the property, the morning dew and the automated sprinkler system will have washed away any chemical residue. The entire scene will look like a tragic accident caused by an overworked, clumsy woman wearing high heels." Beatrice paced the small corner of the room, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. "Do not speak to me about being realistic," she retorted bitterly. "You completely lost control of the narrative the moment that ridiculous paramedic called for police backup. We are trapped in this hospital. We cannot take her home to manage her recovery. If she wakes up and points a finger at you, you will spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary, and I will lose everything." I listened to their horrific exchange, my blood turning to absolute ice inside my paralyzed veins. They were casually discussing my attempted murder as if they were reviewing a poorly executed business transaction. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty was suffocating. I had bought Beatrice the very designer wrap she was wearing. I had paid off Bradley countless failed startup debts. In return, they had conspired to crack my skull open on my own front porch. "Stop acting like a paranoid old woman," Bradley growled, stepping closer to her to assert his dominance. "I have handled every single detail. I wiped the primary security hard drive myself an hour before the party started. The front door camera was completely deactivated. There is zero digital evidence connecting me to that staircase. I made sure of it." He paused, letting out a dark, triumphant chuckle that made my stomach churn with violent nausea. "Besides, it does not matter if she wakes up next week or next month." He continued, his voice dripping with pure malice. "The game is already won." "Are you sure the camera was off?" Beatrice asked, her tone shifting from angry to eagerly conspiratorial. "I am positive," Bradley confirmed proudly. "And that is not even the best part. Do you remember that massive stack of quarterly tax documents her accounting team sent over yesterday morning? She was so exhausted from working a 14-hour shift that she barely glanced at the pages before signing them. I slipped a comprehensive, durable power of attorney document right into the middle of the stack. She signed her life away without even reading the header. My heart monitor spiked wildly, the machine emitting a rapid, high-pitched warning alarm. The sudden noise startled them, but neither Bradley nor Beatrice bothered to step forward to check on my physical well-being. They simply waited in the shadows for the mechanical beeping to return to a steady, normal rhythm. The reality of his words hit me with the destructive force of a freight train. A durable power of attorney. I had mindlessly signed a document granting Bradley absolute, unrestricted legal authority over my entire existence. Because I was currently incapacitated and locked in a state of spinal shock, that document was legally binding right this very second. He now possessed the absolute power to access my private bank accounts, liquidate my investment portfolios, and sell my massive real estate holdings. Even more terrifying, he had the legal authority to walk into my wealth management firm tomorrow morning and completely dismantle the company I had sacrificed my entire youth to build. He could legally authorize my medical decisions. He could legally instruct the doctors to withdraw my life support if he deemed my recovery hopeless. I was entirely at his mercy. "We do not need to bring her back to the mansion," Bradley whispered, his voice filled with greedy anticipation. "The moment the banks open their doors tomorrow morning, I am walking straight into the executive branch. I will present the signed power of attorney and the medical declaration of her incapacitation. I am going to empty her primary accounts and wire the funds directly into my offshore crypto wallet. By the time her fancy corporate lawyers figure out what happened, the money will be completely untraceable. We will have enough cash to leave this miserable city and live like royalty while she rots in a state-funded nursing facility." Beatrice let out a low, satisfied hum. "You better make sure that document is bulletproof," she warned him. "Her legal team is vicious. It is ironclad," Bradley promised confidently. "I paid a very expensive, very discreet notary to stamp it." "She is finished, Mother. The trailer park queen has finally been dethroned." I lay imprisoned in my sterile bed, surrounded by monitors that beeped in quiet mockery of my helplessness. My limbs were dead weight, my voice was silenced, and my husband was actively preparing to loot my entire life savings at the crack of dawn. Panic threatened to completely consume my mind, urging me to surrender to the darkness. But a fierce, burning rage quickly pushed the panic aside. I had not clawed my way out of poverty to be robbed blind by a mediocre, talentless parasite. I needed a weapon. I needed a lifeline. I needed to contact Harrison Cole, my ruthless corporate attorney, and I needed to reach Kendrick, my brilliant brother-in-law, who understood digital security better than anyone. But how could I possibly sound the alarm when I could not even wiggle a single finger? The clock was rapidly ticking toward morning. The ultimate battle for my life and my legacy had officially begun, and I had to find a way to strike back from inside my paralyzed cage before the sun came up. The heavy silence of the intensive care unit was violently shattered by the sound of rapid, authoritative footsteps echoing down the sterile hallway. The automatic doors to my suite slid open with a sharp, mechanical hiss, and Harrison Cole marched into the room. Harrison was not just a corporate attorney. He was a ruthless legal predator who had spent 40 years dismantling hostile takeovers and crushing greedy relatives in high-stakes estate battles across the country. Dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, he radiated an aura of absolute terrifying power. He did not ask for permission to enter. He simply invaded the space carrying a thick leather briefcase that felt like a weapon. Bradley spun around, his fake grief instantly replaced by genuine alarm. Beatrice took a step back, instinctively intimidated by the sheer physical presence of the man who managed my multi-million-dollar empire. "What are you doing here?" Bradley demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a deeper, more aggressive register. "This is a private medical facility. My wife just suffered a catastrophic accident and she needs absolute rest. You need to leave immediately." Harrison ignored him completely. He walked straight toward my bed, his sharp blue eyes scanning my paralyzed body, the cervical collar, and the array of monitors tracking my vital signs. He stood at the foot of my bed, his hands resting firmly on the plastic footboard. "Madison," Harrison said, his voice deep and remarkably steady, "I received an automated alert from the hospital administration regarding your admission. I am here in my capacity as your chief legal counsel." Before Harrison could say another word, Bradley lunged forward, inserting himself directly between the lawyer and my bed. He puffed out his chest desperately, trying to assert dominance over a man who intimidated corporate giants for a living. "Did you not hear me?" Bradley shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are not welcome in this room. My wife is in a state of severe medical shock. She is completely paralyzed and unresponsive. As her legal husband and her official next of kin, I am taking full control of her care. I want you out of this hospital right now." Beatrice quickly scurried to the wall and slammed her hand against the emergency call button. "Security!" she yelled toward the intercom speaker. "We have an unauthorized intruder harassing a critical patient. Send your guards to this room immediately." Harrison did not even flinch. He slowly turned his head to look at Bradley, his expression settling into a mask of pure freezing contempt. "You do not dictate terms to me, Bradley," Harrison stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet decibel. "I represent the wealth management firm and the personal estate of the woman lying in that bed. My fiduciary duty is to her and her alone. I am well aware of your massive financial liabilities, your failing cryptocurrency ventures, and your sudden desperate interest in her medical directives. If you think you can isolate my client to facilitate a hostile financial takeover while she is incapacitated, you are vastly underestimating the legal hellfire I will rain down upon you." Bradley swallowed hard, a flash of genuine panic crossing his eyes, but he quickly masked it with arrogant outrage. He pointed a shaking finger at the hallway. "I am her husband." Bradley spat out the words like venom. "Under state law, I hold total medical and legal authority over her while she is in this condition. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here, Harrison. You are just a hired suit. I forbid you from contacting her. I forbid you from accessing her medical records. I am restricting all visitors starting right this second. Nobody comes into this room without my explicit written permission. Now get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Two large hospital security guards appeared in the doorway, looking cautiously between the furious husband and the imposing attorney. "Sir," one of the guards said, approaching Harrison carefully, "the husband has the legal right to restrict visitors. We are going to have to ask you to step outside the intensive care unit." Harrison knew the law better than anyone in that building. He knew that pushing past security would only result in a useless arrest, which would leave me entirely defenseless. He slowly picked up his leather briefcase, his face an impenetrable mask of cold calculation. But before he turned to comply with the guards, Harrison took one deliberate step around Bradley. He leaned slightly over the side rail of my hospital bed, bringing his face just inches from mine. Bradley yelled for the guards to grab him, but Harrison ignored the chaos erupting behind his back. He looked deep into my eyes. He searched the terrified, frozen depths of my pupils, looking for any sign of life trapped inside my paralyzed shell. I summoned every fragment of willpower I possessed. I focused entirely on my eyelids. I stared directly into the sharp blue eyes of the only man who could protect my life-work. I blinked deliberately. Once. Twice. It was a clear, undeniable signal. A silent scream for help. Harrison's breath hitched just for a fraction of a second. The corner of his mouth twitched upward into the briefest, most imperceptible smirk. He caught the signal. He knew I was fully conscious. He knew I was locked inside my body, listening to every single word, entirely aware of the murderous plot my husband was orchestrating. The security guards placed their hands firmly on Harrison's shoulders, pulling him backward toward the sliding glass door. Harrison did not resist, but as he reached the threshold of the room, he locked eyes with Bradley one final time. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Enjoy playing the grieving husband while you can," Bradley Harrison declared, his voice echoing loudly down the sterile hospital corridor for every nurse and doctor to hear. "Because I am heading straight to a federal judge the moment the courthouse opens. If a single penny moves from her corporate accounts, if a single medical decision is made that compromises her safety, or if I find out this so-called accident was anything other than a simple fall, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable existence locked inside a federal prison cell. You are officially on notice." Harrison turned on his heel and strode down the hallway, his powerful footsteps fading into the distance. The security guards lingered near the door, watching Bradley closely before finally retreating to their posts. Bradley stood frozen in the center of the room, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. Beatrice rushed over to him, grabbing his arm with trembling hands. The sheer confidence of Harrison's threat had clearly rattled them to their rotten cores. They had successfully isolated me physically, using their legal status to build a fortress around my hospital bed. But as I lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, a massive surge of hope flooded my paralyzed veins. They thought they had cut off my only lifeline. They had no idea that Harrison Cole was now fully armed with the truth, and my brilliant lawyer was about to start a legal war that would burn their greedy ambitions straight to the ground. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality after Harrison Cole was escorted from the intensive care unit. Bradley and Beatrice had stepped out into the hallway to speak with the hospital administration, desperate to solidify their legal hold over my medical directives. My eyes were fixed on the ceiling tiles when the heavy door slid open again. My sister-in-law Caroline strode into the room reeking of cheap perfume and unearned entitlement. Right behind her was her husband, Kendrick. Kendrick was a brilliant African-American information technology auditor who worked for a top-tier cybersecurity firm. He was sharp, analytical, and completely out of place in this family of greedy parasites. Unlike Bradley, Kendrick actually worked for his money and possessed a strict moral compass. He took one look at my immobilized body, hooked up to the breathing apparatus, and I saw a flash of genuine horror cross his dark features. Caroline, however, did not even pretend to offer a sympathetic glance toward my hospital bed. She made a direct line for the small plastic belongings bag the nurses had placed on the corner chair. "What are you doing?" Caroline Kendrick asked, his deep voice, thick with thinly veiled disgust. His posture stiffened as he watched his wife aggressively tear open the clear plastic bag containing the clothes and personal items I had been wearing during the fall. She shoved her manicured hands deep into the blood-stained fabric of my dress, completely unfazed by the gruesome sight. "Bradley sent me a text message right before we got off the elevator," Caroline muttered, her eyes darting around the room like a common thief. "He said he needs the master key to her home office safe. The banks are requesting secondary verification for the corporate accounts, and all her physical authentication tokens are locked inside that steel box." She dumped the contents of my designer handbag onto the vinyl guest chair, carelessly tossing aside my expensive cosmetics and personal identification cards. Kendrick clenched his jaw so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. "You are actively searching a paralyzed woman. Belongings for a safe key, while she lies completely helpless right in front of you," Kendrick stated flatly, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Have you people entirely lost your minds? She could have severe brain damage." Caroline scoffed, ripping open the hidden zipper compartment of my wallet. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Kendrick. She is basically brain dead anyway. My brother is just trying to secure the family assets before the market opens tomorrow. He needs that key right now." I lay frozen on the mattress, boiling with an indescribable rage. Caroline was happily acting as an accomplice to her brother's financial heist, treating my tragic accident like a lucrative treasure hunt. She aggressively patted down the pockets of my ruined jacket, muttering curses under her breath when she came up empty-handed. Kendrick watched her frantic search with cold, analytical eyes. He was a man who spotted discrepancies for a living, and the massive discrepancies in this entire situation were practically screaming at him. Suddenly, Caroline's cell phone buzzed loudly in her pocket. She pulled it out, her face lighting up with greedy anticipation as she read the caller identification. "It is my mother," Caroline announced quickly, grabbing her purse. "She probably has an update from the hospital billing department. I need to take this in the hallway, where the reception is better. Do not touch anything, Kendrick. I will be right back to finish checking her coat." Caroline practically sprinted out of the intensive care unit, the heavy glass door sliding shut behind her, sealing Kendrick and me inside the quiet, sterile room. The moment we were completely alone, Kendrick's demeanor instantly transformed. The rigid, annoyed brother-in-law vanished, replaced by the highly trained cybersecurity expert. He moved swiftly and silently toward my hospital bed, checking the hallway through the glass blinds to ensure Caroline was completely distracted. He leaned down over the metal side rail, bringing his face close to mine. Madison, Kendrick whispered, his deep voice barely audible over the hum of the oxygen machine. "I know you are in there. I saw the medical charts at the nurses' station. Spinal shock does not mean brain death. I know your mind is fully awake." I stared directly into his dark, intense eyes. I summoned every remaining ounce of energy in my paralyzed body and gave him one slow, deliberate blink. Kendrick let out a sharp breath of relief, a fierce, determined fire ignited in his gaze. "Listen to me very carefully, Madison. he urged, moving with lightning speed. He reached into the inner pocket of his dark jacket and pulled out a tiny, sophisticated piece of hardware. It was a miniature eye-tracking sensor, completely discreet and highly advanced. Attached to it by a thin wire was a small modified burner smartphone. Bradley is moving incredibly fast, Kendrick explained quickly. He already submitted the forged power of attorney to your primary investment bank. He is trying to drain the corporate liquidity funds before the morning bell. Kendrick swiftly slid the burner phone deep under my mattress pad, where the nurses would never feel it during routine checks. He then took the tiny eye tracker and expertly clipped it to the flexible plastic arm of my supplemental oxygen tube, positioning the microscopic camera directly in front of my right pupil. It blended in perfectly with the medical equipment. I bypassed the biometric lock on this device. Kendrick continued, his fingers flying across the screen before hiding it away. The eye tracker is calibrated to your pupil movements. You can type send encrypted messages and access the internet just by looking at the custom keyboard on the hidden screen projection. It is connected to a secure, untraceable cellular network. Harrison Cole has the encryption key. You have a direct line to your lawyer now. I blinked twice, a silent, overwhelming expression of pure gratitude. My brother-in-law was risking his entire career and his marriage to save my life. I am not done yet, Kendrick whispered fiercely, his eyes narrowing with cold resolve. I know Bradley is a pathological liar, and I know he disabled the primary security cameras before your fall. But he is a technological amateur. He does not know about the secondary local area network you asked me to install on the private servers last year. I am going to hack directly into your home security mainframe tonight. I am going to bypass his primitive wipes and dig through the deleted cache. If he did anything to cause this accident, I will find the digital footprint, and I will hand the evidence directly to the federal authorities. The handle on the sliding glass door began to turn. Kendrick instantly snapped backward, crossing his arms and adopting his previous stance of mild annoyance, just as Caroline pushed her way back into the room. My mother says the hospital administration is giving them pushback on the discharge papers, Caroline complained, marching right back to my ruined belongings. She shoved her hands back into my blood-stained coat. We need to find that safe key so Bradley can pay off the medical director. I lay completely motionless on the sterile hospital bed, but inside a ferocious battle cry echoed through my mind. The tiny sensor hovered invisibly near my eye, a powerful digital weapon handed to me by the ultimate inside ally. Bradley thought he had completely isolated me. He thought he had severed my voice and stolen my empire. He was blissfully unaware that I was now armed, fully connected to my ruthless attorney, and backed by a cybersecurity expert who was about to tear his murderous lies apart, line by line of code. The real war had just begun. The morning sun had barely crested the city skyline when the private elevator doors opened on the top floor of my wealth management firm. Lying in my hospital bed, I stared intensely at the hidden screen projected by the eye tracker Kendrick had miraculously installed. The encrypted feed bypassed the hospital network entirely, feeding direct high-definition security footage from my corporate headquarters straight to my pupil. I watched with burning fury as Bradley strutted into the immaculate glass reception area of the empire I had built from nothing. He was wearing one of the bespoke Italian suits I had purchased for his birthday, completely abandoning his usual casual tech bro aesthetic. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and walked with the unearned arrogance of a conquering king claiming a stolen throne. My chief operating officer and my entire executive board were already scrambling into the main conference room. Bradley had authorized an emergency mandate using my personal email account, which he had undoubtedly hacked overnight. The boardroom was my sacred sanctuary, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district and a massive mahogany table where I had negotiated billion-dollar portfolios. Bradley took my seat at the head of the table, dropping his briefcase onto the polished wood with a loud, aggressive thud. The executive team exchanged nervous glances. Gregory Pierce, my chief financial officer, sat to the immediate right of Bradley. Gregory was a veteran of the financial industry, a man who relied strictly on data compliance and absolute transparency. He adjusted his glasses, looking at Bradley with clear apprehension. Thank you all for gathering on such short notice. Bradley began, his voice adopting a practiced mournful tone that made my stomach churn. I come to you this morning with absolutely devastating news regarding my wife. Last night, Madison suffered a catastrophic accident at our home. She fell down a flight of marble stairs and sustained severe irreversible trauma to her brain and spinal cord. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. Several of my executives covered their mouths in genuine shock. Gregory leaned forward, his face pale with concern. Bradley wiped a completely fabricated tear from his eye. The leading neurologists have informed my mother and me that Madison is in a permanent vegetative state. She has zero cognitive function and zero chance of recovery. The brilliant woman who built this incredible firm is gone. I blinked rapidly at the screen, furious at his monstrous lies. I was entirely conscious, entirely aware, and actively watching him attempt to dismantle my life work. But Madison was a visionary. Bradley continued, swiftly pivoting from his fake grief to his true agenda. She prepared for every worst-case scenario. She knew that her family and her company needed to be protected if the unthinkable ever happened to her. Bradley reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slapped the papers down onto the center of the mahogany table. "This is a comprehensive, durable power of attorney," Bradley announced, his voice suddenly ringing with aggressive authority. Madison signed this document in front of a licensed notary public. "It grants me total, unrestricted legal and financial control over her personal estate and this entire wealth management firm. Effective immediately, I am assuming the role of acting chief executive officer." The boardroom fell dead silent. I could see the sheer disbelief washing over my team. I had never allowed Bradley anywhere near my corporate assets. My executives knew perfectly well that I considered his cryptocurrency ventures to be highly volatile and utterly reckless. Gregory Pierce carefully reached out and pulled the document toward him. He flipped through the pages, scanning the legal jargon and scrutinizing my forged signature on the final page. "We need to stabilize the company portfolio to prevent a panic among our top-tier investors," Bradley commanded, leaning over the table. "To ensure market confidence, I am initiating an immediate capital injection into a secure secondary holding firm that I personally manage. Gregory, I need you to authorize an emergency wire transfer of $5 million from the primary corporate liquidity account to the offshore routing number provided in that folder." Gregory froze. He slowly looked up from the fraudulent document, his eyes narrowing as he locked his gaze onto my husband. $5 million? Gregory repeated, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. "You are asking me to liquidate $5 million of operating capital and wire it to an unverified offshore crypto wallet less than 12 hours after our founder supposedly suffered brain death. It is not a request." Gregory Bradley snapped his mask of the grieving husband, completely slipping away to reveal the greedy parasite underneath. "It is a direct executive order from the legal head of this company. My crypto fund is uniquely positioned to hedge against the impending market volatility caused by Madison's tragic accident. Process the wire transfer immediately." I watched the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. Bradley was panicking. His illegal debts to the criminal underworld were clearly coming due, and he was using my tragedy as a pathetic excuse to rob my company blind. Gregory calmly closed the folder and pushed it back across the table toward Bradley. "I cannot and will not authorize that transfer," Gregory stated, his voice resonating with unwavering professional integrity. "Company protocol mandates that any executive transition or massive liquidation of assets must be verified by our chief legal counsel, Harrison Cole. Furthermore, a power of attorney enacting total corporate control requires independent medical verification of incapacitation from a hospital board, not just the word of a spouse." Bradley's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He slammed both of his fists down onto the mahogany table, rattling the expensive glass water pitchers. "Harrison Cole is a glorified paper pusher," Bradley roared, spit flying from his lips. "I hold the ultimate authority here. I am the legal proxy of this firm. You work for me now, Gregory. I work for Madison, and I protect her investors." Gregory fired back, refusing to back down a single inch. Until Harrison Cole walks into this room and legally validates that piece of paper, not a single cent is leaving this building. Bradley's chest heaved with unchecked rage. He grabbed the fraudulent document and shoved it directly into Gregory's face. You have exactly 24 hours to verify whatever you need to verify. Bradley snarled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. If that $5 million is not sitting in my holding account by this time tomorrow morning, I will personally fire you and every single executive sitting at this table. I will liquidate your pensions and destroy your careers. Do not test me. Bradley snatched his briefcase and stormed out of the boardroom, leaving the executive team in stunned, terrified silence. I closed my eyes in the hospital bed, a fierce, triumphant energy pulsing through my paralyzed body. Bradley thought he could bully his way to $5 million, but he had just declared war on a team I had trained to be absolutely ruthless. The clock was ticking, and he had no idea that Harrison Cole was already armed with the truth, preparing to drop the ultimate legal guillotine on his pathetic scheme. The sterile hospital ceiling became my digital battlefield. Through the tiny lens of the eye tracker, Kendrick had perfectly positioned on my oxygen tube, a translucent digital keyboard projected directly onto my retina. Every single blink required a monumental effort of will. My physical body remained a lifeless shell on the intensive care mattress, but my mind was operating at a terrifying velocity. I had to stop Bradley before he could bully Gregory and the executive board into releasing my life work into his fraudulent cryptocurrency accounts. I focused my right pupil on the letter H. I blinked deliberately. Then the letter A. Another precise blink. The sophisticated software registered my micro-movements with absolute perfection, translating my desperate gaze into a highly encrypted message. Typing a single sentence took agonizing minutes. My eyes burned from the intense concentration, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma ward threatened to trigger a massive headache, but I refused to close my eyes. I navigated through the secure firewall Kendrick had bypassed, accessing the direct, untraceable communication line to Harrison Cole. Harrison and I had spent years preparing for hostile corporate takeovers. We had designed a catastrophic fail-safe protocol for the firm, an absolute nuclear option known only to the two of us and our senior security architects. It was called Protocol Lazarus. If enacted, it would instantly sever all external access to every single corporate bank account, lock down the entire investment portfolio, and revoke all executive signing privileges across the board. It required a unique dual authentication code that I had memorized on the day we incorporated the wealth management firm. I stared at the projected command line. I focused my vision and blinked out the sequence. Protocol Lazarus authorized. Execute immediate financial freeze. I added a second line warning Harrison about the forged power of attorney and Bradley demanding $5 million from Gregory. I hit the digital send button with one final forceful blink. A green confirmation banner flashed across my vision, indicating the encrypted message had successfully reached Harrison's private server. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillow, my heart hammering against my ribs. The digital missile had been launched. Now I just had to wait for the explosion. Across the city, inside the towering glass skyscraper of the primary investment bank handling my corporate liquidity, Bradley was pacing like a caged predator. The eye tracker feed had switched back to the secondary security cameras, allowing me to watch his heist unfold in real time. He was inside the plush, soundproof office of the senior bank manager, a man named Preston. Bradley was practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. He had completely abandoned the grieving husband routine. He slapped the fraudulent power of attorney onto Preston's heavy mahogany desk, demanding immediate compliance. I do not care about the standard 24-hour holding period, Bradley snapped, leaning over the desk to intimidate the banker. My wife is lying in a hospital bed with catastrophic brain damage. The board of directors has already been notified of my executive takeover. I need that $5 million routed to the specified holding account right this second to prevent a total market panic. Process the wire transfer. Preston or I will pull every single corporate account from this bank by tomorrow afternoon. Preston adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable with Bradley's aggressive behavior. He picked up the forged document verifying the notary stamp and my fraudulent signature. Everything appeared legally sound on the surface. Preston sighed, turning to his dual monitor setup. He entered the corporate account numbers and initiated the massive wire transfer. Bradley stood right behind him, his eyes locked greedily onto the computer screen. He could practically taste the stolen millions. He was already calculating how quickly he could pay off the dangerous criminals he owed, and still have enough left over to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Preston's fingers hovered over the final execution key. He pressed enter to finalize the transaction. For a split second, the loading icon spun perfectly. Bradley let out a sharp breath of relief, a smug, victorious smile stretching across his face. Then the entire banking system froze. The loading icon vanished, replaced instantly by a massive, blinding red warning banner that locked both of the monitors. The digital alarm flashed with a terrifying, undeniable message. Account frozen. Active legal dispute. Protocol Lazarus initiated. All executive privileges revoked by order of Chief Legal Counsel. Preston gasped, physically recoiling from the computer screens. He frantically clicked his mouse and slammed his fingers against the keyboard, but the system was completely dead. A secondary message popped up instructing the bank to instantly reject all transactions and contact Harrison Cole immediately. "What did you do?" Bradley roared, the smug smile vanishing entirely from his face. His voice cracked with pure, unadulterated panic. "Process the wire transfer. I gave you a legally binding power of attorney. I am the acting chief executive officer. You are stealing my money." Preston held up his hands defensively, his face completely pale. "I did not do anything, sir," Preston stammered, pointing at the flashing red screen. "The account has been hit with a maximum security legal freeze. The system literally will not allow me to bypass it. The firm chief legal counsel just executed an emergency lockdown protocol. The funds are totally inaccessible. The account is completely frozen until the legal dispute is resolved in federal court." The realization hit Bradley with the destructive force of a wrecking ball. He stared at the red warning banner, his chest heaving with rapid, terrified breaths. Harrison Cole had moved faster than he ever anticipated. The lawyer had completely neutralized the forged document in a matter of seconds. Bradley realized he was not just fighting a paralyzed woman anymore. Someone highly capable, incredibly dangerous, and legally ruthless was actively pulling the strings behind the scenes to destroy his heist. Bradley absolutely snapped. The thin veneer of his fake businessman persona completely shattered, revealing the violent, unstable parasite underneath. He grabbed the heavy brass lamp sitting on Preston's desk and violently hurled it against the wall, shattering it into 100 pieces. He swept his arm across the desk, knocking the expensive computer monitors, the keyboard, and stacks of financial documents crashing to the floor. Preston shouted for bank security, scrambling out of his leather chair to escape the sudden violent outburst. Bradley ignored the terrified banker. He grabbed the useless forged power of attorney from the ruined desk and crumpled it in his shaking hands. He kicked a heavy leather guest chair across the room, screaming a string of vicious curses that echoed through the private banking suite. His perfect plan had just been entirely incinerated. The $5 million he desperately needed to save his own life from the criminal underworld was locked tightly inside an impenetrable digital vault. I watched his complete psychological meltdown through the encrypted feed on my eye tracker. Lying perfectly still in my hospital bed, an overwhelming wave of fierce, triumphant satisfaction washed over my paralyzed body. Bradley was officially trapped. He had zero money, zero power, and a massive debt hanging over his head. The ultimate counterattack had been executed flawlessly, and my husband was finally beginning to understand that he had picked a war with the wrong woman. The blinding red warning banner on the bank monitor had completely shattered Bradley and his illusion of absolute control. My husband had stormed out of the financial district with his empty briefcase and a terrifying reality checking in. He was locked out of my corporate empire. Harrison Cole had effectively slammed the steel vault shut on my $5 million. But Bradley was a cornered animal, and cornered animals with massive illicit debts to the criminal underworld do not just surrender. They find another way to feed. If he could not steal my corporate liquidity through forged legal documents, he was going to leverage the only other asset he possessed: his social media following. Lying in my intensive care bed, I watched the digital projection from Kendrick's hidden eye tracker illuminate my retina. The device buzzed with a priority notification from Kendrick's secure server. My brother-in-law had flagged a massive spike in digital traffic originating from Bradley public profiles. I focused my right pupil and blinked to open the encrypted link. What I saw made the blood in my paralyzed veins run absolute ice cold. Bradley had uploaded a heavily manipulated video to every single one of his social media platforms. He had taken the horrifying footage he recorded of me bleeding out on our marble driveway and turned it into a grotesque masterpiece of digital manipulation. He expertly cut out the audio of him laughing and telling me to stop pretending. He edited out Beatrice's cruel remarks about my trailer park upbringing. Instead, he layered a melancholy acoustic piano track over the silent footage of my broken body. Then he added a voiceover. He had recorded himself sobbing, a perfect imitation of a shattered man begging the universe to spare his beloved wife. The caption below the video was a masterclass in psychological warfare and character assassination. It read, "My beautiful wife Madison pushed herself too hard. She sacrificed her health, her family, and her peace of mind to build her wealth management firm. She worked 18-hour days until her body simply gave out. Her exhaustion caused her to collapse on our front steps. Please let this be a warning to everyone. No amount of money is worth losing the person you love. Pray for her survival." He was publicly blaming my catastrophic spinal injury on my own ambition. He was weaponizing my dedication to my career to paint me as a neglectful workaholic who had brought this horrific accident upon herself. But the character assassination was just the setup for the real objective. Attached to the viral video was a prominent link to a crowdfunding campaign. The campaign title boldly demanded $1 million for Madison emergency experimental spinal treatments. Bradley had written a lengthy, heartbreaking description claiming that my insurance refused to cover the cutting-edge neurological surgeries required to save my life. He begged his followers and the general public to donate whatever they could spare to help him afford the exorbitant medical costs. It was a complete and utter fabrication. My premium health insurance covered every single aspect of my intensive care, and Bradley had zero intention of paying a hospital bill. That $1 million was destined straight for the offshore cryptocurrency wallets of the violent loan sharks he owed. I blinked rapidly, scrolling down the page. The video had hit the algorithm perfectly. It was already accumulating hundreds of thousands of views. The progress bar on the fundraising campaign was actively climbing. $5,000, $20,000, $50,000. The numbers ticked upward in real time as sympathetic strangers blindly emptied their wallets into his fraudulent account. The most agonizing part was not the financial theft. It was the absolute vitriol in the comment section. Bradley's carefully crafted narrative had successfully turned the entire internet against me. I watched helpless and immobilized as thousands of strangers dissected my character and validated his lies. I focused my eyes on the top comments. A user with thousands of likes had written, "This is exactly what happens when women try to act like corporate machines and forget how to be wives. She brought this on herself by prioritizing greed over her marriage." Another comment read, "Her poor husband looks completely devastated. He clearly loved her so much, and she just neglected him for her business. I hope he finds peace." A third chimed in, saying she chased the almighty dollar until she literally fell over. Now all that money cannot even buy her a functioning spine. They called me a cold, heartless villain who deserved to be humbled. They praised Bradley as a devoted, loyal partner, standing by a wife who had never truly appreciated him. He was absorbing their praise and their money while I was being digitally crucified. The sheer injustice of it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, restricting the oxygen flow from my nasal cannula. He was monetizing my attempted murder. He had pushed me down those stairs to steal my company, and when Harrison blocked that avenue, he immediately pivoted to using my paralyzed body as a prop to scam the public. He was turning my trauma into a lucrative crowdfunding enterprise to save his own skin from the criminal syndicate. A fresh wave of donations flooded the screen. $100,000 crossed the threshold. Bradley was winning the public relations war. He was securing the liquid cash he desperately needed to stay alive. But as I read the hateful comments calling me a failure, I did not break. I did not surrender to the despair trying to drag me under. The rage that ignited inside me was purer and hotter than anything I had ever experienced. Bradley thought he was a genius for exploiting the internet. He failed to realize that by creating this massive public spectacle, he was handing me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. Every single dollar that entered that fraudulent account constituted a federal count of wire fraud. By soliciting funds under false pretenses across state lines using a digital platform, he was elevating his crimes to the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was publicly documenting his own felonies for the entire world to see. I blinked deliberately at the eye tracker interface, capturing high-resolution screenshots of the video, the donation counter, and the fraudulent medical claims. I compiled the digital evidence into a secure file. He wanted to use the internet to paint me as a tragic cautionary tale. I was going to use his own viral scam to guarantee he spent the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I closed the browser window and sent the compiled evidence packet directly to Kendrick's encrypted server. The trap was being laid, and my husband was happily walking right into the center of it. The digital projection of the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign faded from my retina as the heavy intensive care unit door slid open. The sudden shift in air pressure signaled an intruder. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles, maintaining the blank, vacant stare of a woman permanently locked in a vegetative state. The sharp, unmistakable clack of designer heels on the linoleum floor told me exactly who had breached my sanctuary before she even stepped into my line of sight. Beatrice. She did not bother bringing Bradley with her this time. She did not need to play the devastated weeping mother-in-law for the medical staff or the police officers guarding the hallway. She marched straight to the large glass window facing the busy hospital corridor and aggressively yanked the privacy blinds completely shut. The bright fluorescent light from the hallway vanished instantly, plunging my sterile hospital room into harsh claustrophobic shadows. She slowly walked over to my bedside, her expensive silk scarf trailing behind her like a royal cape, a cape I had paid for with the corporate profits from my wealth management firm. Beatrice leaned over the metal bed rail, bringing her face uncomfortably close to mine. The sickeningly sweet scent of her imported floral perfume filled my nostrils temporarily, overpowering the sharp, sterile smell of medical antiseptic. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the plastic edge of my mattress, her knuckles turning white with suppressed, malicious excitement. She looked down at my immobilized body with an expression of pure, unfiltered triumph. "You really thought you were so incredibly smart? Did you not?" Beatrice whispered, her voice a toxic, venomous hiss that echoed perfectly in the quiet, darkened room. "You thought your ruthless little corporate lawyer could swoop in here and completely destroy my son. Well, Harrison Cole might have frozen your precious company accounts, but he cannot touch the digital goldmine Bradley just created on the internet." She let out a low, dark chuckle that made the hairs on the back of my neck want to stand up. "My son is a brilliant survivor, Madison. Your fancy lawyer essentially locked the front door of the bank, so Bradley simply opened a massive window on social media. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are pouring directly into his private, untraceable accounts right this very second. The entire world thinks you are a tragic, overworked corporate failure, and they are happily paying my son for his tremendous suffering. You handed him the ultimate payday by falling down those stairs. He does not even need your corporate liquidity anymore. The generous public is literally funding our escape plan while you lie here completely useless. Beatrice reached out and forcefully poked my limp, paralyzed shoulder with her index finger. I felt absolutely nothing from her physical touch, but the sheer disrespect burned through my mind like acid. She had always viewed my existence as a stain on her family prestige, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that her family was entirely bankrupt before I married her son. You are nothing but a broken piece of meat occupying an incredibly expensive hospital bed. Beatrice continued, her eyes gleaming with pure hatred. Bradley is legally processing the medical paperwork with the hospital administration as we speak. You think you are staying in this fancy private suite under police protection forever. Think again. The moment the doctors officially declare your spinal condition permanent next week, I am personally taking charge of your long-term medical placement. As your legally designated caregivers, we have the absolute right to determine where you spend the rest of your vegetative life. She leaned even closer, her hot breath washing over my cheek. I am going to throw you into the most miserable, understaffed state-funded nursing home I can legally find in this entire country. I will find a facility so utterly neglected and disgusting that the nurses will not even bother to turn you over to prevent the bed sores. You will rot in a dark, filthy room staring at a cracked ceiling, completely forgotten by your fancy corporate executives and your high-priced lawyers. And while you are slowly decaying in that miserable facility, Bradley and I will be living like royalty in your multi-million-dollar mansion, spending every single penny you broke your back to earn. You are finished, Madison. You lose. Beatrice straightened her posture, giving me one final contemptuous glare before turning on her heel. She adjusted her expensive scarf and marched proudly out of the intensive care unit, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind her and leaving me entirely alone in the dim, quiet room. I lay there processing the sheer magnitude of her horrific threats. They truly believed I was a defeated, paralyzed victim, heading for a miserable, silent end. They were fully prepared to discard my living body into a medical nightmare just to secure their stolen luxury. But as the heavy hospital door clicked shut, something miraculous happened. Deep inside my right arm, a sudden sharp jolt of pure electricity fired through my damaged nerves. It was not a phantom sensation. It was a violent, burning spark of neurological activity racing down my forearm, straight past my wrist and directly into my hand. My right index finger twitched. It was a microscopic movement, barely a fraction of an inch, but it was undeniable. A few seconds later, a fierce, prickling sensation of pins and needles flooded my right palm. My middle finger curled slightly inward, brushing against the rough texture of the hospital blanket. The terrifying grip of the spinal shock was officially breaking. The massive trauma swelling around my cervical spine had finally begun to subside, allowing my powerful brain to actively reconnect with my physical body. I was regaining my motor functions. A fierce, triumphant scream echoed silently through my mind. I could feel the cold air-conditioned breeze hitting my fingertips. I could feel the stiff fabric of the medical gown resting against my collarbone. The sensory input was overwhelming, a beautiful symphony of returning life. But I knew that if I alerted the medical staff to my sudden recovery right now, the entire game would be compromised. Bradley would instantly play the relieved, weeping husband and desperately try to cover his murderous tracks. He would delete the viral videos, hide the GoFundMe money, and pretend the entire fraud was just a misunderstanding born of grief. I could not let him escape the federal trap he had just built for himself. I had to remain completely paralyzed. I had to stay locked in this physical prison, playing the ultimate game of deception until the absolute perfect moment to strike. I forced my recovering hand to relax aggressively, suppressing the overwhelming, desperate urge to move my limbs. I locked my eyes straight ahead at the acoustic ceiling tiles, fully embracing the role of the helpless, brain-dead victim while my nervous system quietly roared back to life, preparing my body for absolute, devastating warfare. The sterile silence of the intensive care unit was broken only by the steady rhythm of my heart monitor. I lay perfectly still, commanding my newly awakened nerves to remain completely dormant. The faint tingling in my fingertips was a massive victory, but I knew I had to maintain the illusion of absolute paralysis. Suddenly, a bright crimson notification flashed across the hidden screen, projected directly onto my right retina. The digital interface of the eye tracker buzzed with an incoming encrypted transmission from Kendrick. The priority level was marked as critical. I focused my pupil on the flashing icon and blinked twice to open the secure channel. Kendrick did not waste a single second with polite greetings. His text materialized across my vision in rapid block letters. He had been digging through our home network architecture for the past 12 hours. Bradley thought he was a tech genius for wiping the primary security servers before the birthday party. He had proudly deleted every single file on the local hard drives, assuming he had erased all digital evidence of his actions on the driveway. But Bradley was a superficial amateur who only understood the absolute basics of network security. He had completely overlooked the tiny standalone camera hidden inside the ornate bronze light fixture mounted right above the main entrance. I had personally installed that specific camera 8 months ago. I never connected it to the house wireless network. It ran on a long-lasting lithium battery and transmitted data through its own independent cellular connection directly to a secure cloud server. I originally bought it because expensive watches and large amounts of cash had been mysteriously disappearing from my home office. I suspected Bradley was stealing from me to fund his fake cryptocurrency lifestyle, and I wanted indisputable proof. I never imagined that my trap for a petty thief would end up capturing the chilling documentation of my own attempted murder. Kendrick's message continued. He had breached the cloud server and retrieved the uploaded footage from the evening of the party. I am sending you the video file now. Kendrick wrote, his text appearing stark and urgent against my retina. You need to prepare yourself for what you are about to see. He did not just let you fall. This was entirely premeditated. A video file materialized on the screen. I blinked to initiate the playback. The high-definition footage was crystal clear, capturing the sprawling marble staircase in front of our mansion, exactly 2 hours before the first party guests arrived. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone. Bradley stepped into the frame. He was dressed in his casual lounge clothes, carrying a small metal tin and a thick microfiber cloth. He looked around cautiously, scanning the driveway and the street to ensure he was completely alone. He did not look up at the bronze light fixture. I watched with a suffocating sense of horror as my husband walked directly to the top landing of the marble staircase. He dropped to his knees. He opened the metal tin, revealing a dense industrial-grade polishing wax. He scooped a large amount of the slick substance onto his cloth and began rubbing it aggressively into the stone. He was not waxing the entire step. He was highly methodical, concentrating the slippery compound exclusively on a very specific narrow section right at the sharpest edge of the top stair. He applied layer after layer, buffing it until the marble gleamed with a deadly, invisible slickness. He was creating a lethal hazard engineered to look exactly like an unfortunate household accident. But the most terrifying part of the footage was what he did next. Bradley stood up and took a few steps back. He stared down at the wax surface. Then he physically pantomimed a backward fall. He shifted his weight, calculating the exact trajectory a human body would take if it slipped on that specific spot. He looked down at the sharp, brutal angle of the marble edges below. He was actively measuring the distance. He was ensuring that when my foot hit that invisible trap, my head and neck would strike the hardest, most lethal points of the staircase. He repeated the motion twice more, tweaking his imaginary angle, nodding to himself with cold, clinical satisfaction. He was choreographing my death. He wanted to guarantee maximum catastrophic damage to my brainstem and cervical spine. Once he was completely satisfied with his deadly handiwork, he packed up his supplies, wiped his fingerprints from the tin, and casually walked back into the house to change into his custom Italian suit for the party. The video ended freezing on the image of the empty, weaponized staircase. The air in my hospital room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The monitors beeped steadily, masking the absolute hurricane of rage and adrenaline detonating inside my recovering body. This was no longer just a case of domestic financial abuse. This was no longer just a greedy husband taking advantage of a tragic accident to steal corporate funds. The footage I had just witnessed elevated his crimes to a massive, unforgivable felony. This was cold-blooded, calculated attempted murder in the first degree. Bradley had plotted my physical destruction with the meticulous precision of a serial killer. He wanted me dead, and he wanted to inherit my empire as the grieving widower. Kendrick sent one final message below the video file. I have already secured multiple backups of this footage across independent servers. I am preparing a secure dossier for Harrison Cole. We have him dead to rights. I stared at the text, my right hand twitching aggressively against the hospital sheets. The tingling sensation in my limbs was growing stronger by the minute, matching the ferocious power surging through my mind. Bradley had spent the last 48 hours parading around this hospital, playing the victim, shedding fake tears, and demanding access to my millions. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed he had executed the perfect crime and gotten away with it. He had absolutely no idea that he had performed his murderous rehearsal right in front of a high-definition lens. He had no idea that I was lying in this bed, watching his every move, silently regaining my physical strength. The digital evidence was now securely locked in the hands of my brilliant brother-in-law and my ruthless attorney. The trap was fully loaded, and my husband was about to face the devastating, inescapable wrath of the federal justice system. The digital interface projected onto my right retina flashed violently, demanding my immediate attention. Kendrick was far from finished dismantling the illusion of my marriage. Another heavily encrypted file materialized in my field of vision, its priority marked in a stark, glowing red. I focused my pupil and blinked twice to open the data packet, bracing myself for whatever fresh horror my brilliant brother-in-law had unearthed from the darkest corners of my husband's corrupted hard drives. The previous video had proven his murderous intent, but this new dossier provided the exact terrifying motivation behind his lethal actions. The files cascading across my vision painted a picture of absolute suffocating financial desperation. Kendrick had bypassed the superficial layers of Bradley's fake public cryptocurrency portfolio and drilled straight into the hidden encrypted ledgers heavily guarded on the dark web. Bradley was not simply a failed entrepreneur making poor investment choices in a volatile market. He was a dead man walking. The hidden ledgers revealed that my husband had borrowed heavily on an illegal margin from a highly dangerous offshore criminal syndicate. He had used their illicit money to fund a massive, completely unregulated crypto venture. When the digital market suffered a catastrophic crash 6 months ago, his entire fraudulent fund evaporated completely overnight, leaving him holding an empty bag. The balance sheet glared back at me, the final catastrophic number highlighted by Kendrick. Bradley owed this violent underground organization exactly $3 million. Attached to the financial ledger were dozens of intercepted messages from untraceable burner accounts. They were not polite collection notices or standard legal threats. They were graphic, explicit promises of brutal physical violence detailing exactly what the syndicate would do to him and his mother if the $3 million was not transferred in full by the end of this current month. The deadline was rapidly approaching. Bradley was completely out of time, entirely out of leverage, and utterly devoid of options. That was the precise reason he had suddenly grown so incredibly desperate to gain absolute control over my corporate liquidity. My successful wealth management firm was his only remaining lifeline to avoid a violent, bloody death. But Kendrick was incredibly thorough, and he included one final chilling document in the encrypted packet. It was a high-resolution digital scan of my own premium life insurance policy. I had signed that specific policy 5 years ago, designating Bradley as the primary uncontested beneficiary, because I foolishly believed we were building a lifelong partnership based on mutual trust. Kendrick had circled the final payout figure, $10 million guaranteed in the event of my accidental, unexpected death. His monstrous calculated logic was suddenly laid entirely bare before my eyes. Bradley had engineered a horrific, foolproof scenario for himself. If I survived the fall but remained permanently incapacitated under a forged power of attorney, he could systematically drain my corporate accounts to pay off the dangerous syndicate. But if the fall proved fatal, if I succumbed to my severe spinal injuries and died on that cold marble driveway, he would instantly receive a clean, perfectly legal, untraceable $10 million payout from the insurance conglomerate. Either way, my absolute physical destruction was the sole indispensable key to his continued survival. As I processed the sheer depravity of his financial motive, the heavy hospital door cracked open just a few bare inches. Bradley did not step fully inside the intensive care unit. He stood right in the narrow gap, his back turned slightly toward my bed, speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper into his cell phone. The quiet, sterile environment of the trauma ward amplified his panicked voice perfectly, carrying every desperate syllable straight to my ears. I do not care what the hospital administration says or what bureaucratic protocols they are trying to enforce, Bradley hissed aggressively into the receiver. Harrison Cole managed to block the primary bank accounts, but that old dinosaur cannot block a direct physical transfer of her private corporate shares. We are pivoting to the backup plan right now. Just prepare the secondary share transfer documents immediately. Bring them directly to the hospital tonight. There was a brief tense pause as the person on the other end of the line clearly raised a legal objection regarding my physical state and inability to sign a binding contract. Bradley let out a low, venomous scoff that made my blood run cold. I do not care if she cannot physically hold a pen to sign her name. Bradley growled, his voice vibrating with ruthless, unhinged determination. She is completely paralyzed from the neck down and cannot fight back. The law allows for a physical thumbprint in lieu of a signature for incapacitated individuals. I will grab her useless hand and forcefully press her thumb onto the signature line myself. I will make sure the ink is perfect. Just get the notary bought off and get those transfer papers into this room. We execute the final transfer tonight. He ended the call abruptly and pulled the heavy door completely shut, leaving me entirely alone in the sterile silence of the hospital room. A cold, predatory calm washed over my highly active mind. Beneath the thick woven fabric of the hospital blanket, my right hand twitched violently. The tingling, burning fire of returning nerve function was spreading rapidly up my arm through my elbow and into my shoulder. I flexed my fingers deliberately, feeling the coarse cotton sheets beneath my skin. I could form a tight, fully functioning fist. I was no longer a paralyzed victim trapped in a broken shell. I was a fully mobile, highly dangerous weapon waiting in the dark. Bradley wanted to forcefully press my thumb onto a fraudulent contract to steal my entire company. He genuinely believed he had cornered a helpless, brain-dead woman who could offer zero resistance. He thought he was executing a brilliant, foolproof endgame to save himself from the criminal syndicate hunting him down. He had absolutely no idea that I was going to let him bring those fraudulent documents right into this very room. I was going to let him believe he had won his desperate game. I was going to set the ultimate federal trap and let my treacherous husband walk blindly into his own spectacular, irreversible destruction. The heavy door to my intensive care unit hissed open, breaking the midnight silence. Bradley marched into the dim room, followed closely by two men I had never seen before. One wore a cheap, wrinkled suit and clutched a heavy leather briefcase against his chest. The other wore a pristine white medical coat over an expensive tailored shirt, a stethoscope draped carelessly around his neck. They moved with the frantic, nervous energy of criminals trying to execute a high-stakes heist before the security guards caught them. Bradley quickly turned the lock on the hospital door, sealing us securely inside. He had completely bypassed the strict visitor protocols, likely bribing the night shift staff or waiting for the exact moment the floor nurses were distracted by an emergency code down the hall. He walked straight to the side of my bed, his eyes gleaming with a manic, desperate energy. The syndicate deadline was breathing heavily down his neck, and he was ready to cross the ultimate legal line. This was the endgame he had orchestrated outside the hallway just hours ago. He was bringing the fraudulent paperwork right to my bedside, completely convinced I was a broken, helpless victim incapable of stopping him. Bradley gestured sharply to the man in the white coat. "This is Dr. Gallagher, a private neurological consultant." Bradley announced, his voice low and vibrating with malicious intent. "He is here to officially assess your cognitive state for the legal record." Dr. Gallagher stepped forward, pulling a small penlight from his breast pocket. He did not look at my detailed medical charts. He did not check the complex hospital monitors tracking my vital signs. He simply shined the harsh light directly into my pupils for 2 brief seconds. "Excellent pupillary response," Dr. Gallagher stated in a cold, practiced tone. He turned to the man in the wrinkled suit. "As a licensed medical professional, I officially declare that the patient is suffering from acute physical paralysis, but remains entirely lucid and cognitively aware of her surroundings. She is completely capable of understanding binding legal agreements, even if she lacks the motor function to sign them conventionally." It was a perfectly rehearsed, disgusting script. Bradley had bought a corrupt physician to bypass the hospital administration and legally validate the theft of my entire company. The man in the suit, a bribed notary public named Mr. Finch, hastily pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and spread them out evenly on my adjustable tray table. "These are the final transfer documents for your wealth management firm and all associated personal assets," Bradley whispered, leaning aggressively over the metal bed rail. His hot mint-scented breath washed over my face, making my stomach churn with sheer disgust. "The paperwork legally transfers 100% of your corporate shares, your extensive real estate portfolio, and your private investment accounts directly into my personal holding company. Your ruthless corporate lawyer managed to freeze the bank accounts earlier today, but Harrison Cole cannot stop a direct voluntary transfer of ownership. Once your thumbprint is on these pages, I own everything you have ever built. You are going to give me the keys to the kingdom right now." I lay perfectly still on the sterile mattress. The burning sensation in my limbs had intensified significantly over the last few hours. My muscles were practically humming with returning strength. I could easily raise my arm right now and slap the smug, victorious grin straight off his arrogant face. But doing so would only alert him to his miserable failure. If I fought back physically, he would simply flee the hospital and run from the federal authorities before the trap could snap shut. I needed him to firmly believe he had won. I needed him to willingly commit irreversible federal fraud right in front of the hidden eye tracker camera Kendrick had installed. Mr. Finch unscrewed the cap of a black ink pad and placed it precisely next to the transfer documents. Bradley reached down and aggressively grabbed my right wrist. He expected my arm to be dead heavy weight. I quickly forced my muscles to go completely limp, offering zero initial physical resistance as he lifted my hand toward the ink pad. But to sell the perfect illusion, I needed to give him a convincing show. I widened my eyes in mock terror. I let my breathing become rapid and shallow, triggering a slight frantic spike on the electronic heart monitor beside my bed. I locked my gaze directly onto his face, projecting a look of absolute helpless panic. Bradley stared back at me greedily, drinking in my fabricated fear. He let out a dark, cruel laugh that echoed through the quiet room. "Stop fighting it, Madison," he mocked, mistakenly interpreting my rapid breathing as a pathetic, useless attempt to resist his control. "You have absolutely no power left. Your entire little empire belongs to me now." He forcefully pressed my index finger into the thick black ink. I deliberately tensed the strong tendons in my wrist just a tiny fraction of an inch, making it feel as though I was weakly trying to pull my hand away from his violent grasp. Bradley tightened his brutal grip on my knuckles, overpowering my fake resistance with absolute ease. He slammed my inked thumb directly onto the signature line of the primary transfer contract. He repeated the violent, forceful motion on the second page, then the third, pressing my flesh against the paper until the fraudulent deal was perfectly sealed. Mr. Finch quickly gathered the stamped documents, applied his official notary seal to each page, and handed the finalized criminal portfolio back to my husband. Bradley held the paperwork against his chest like a priceless treasure. He was permanently branding his own monumental crimes onto the federal documents, completely unaware that the paralyzed woman he was currently bullying was actively building his permanent prison cell. The trap was now fully set, the execution absolutely flawless. The heavy atmosphere in the intensive care unit grew even more suffocating as Bradley pinned my wrist against the adjustable hospital tray. I kept my breathing deliberately ragged, playing the part of the terrified victim to absolute perfection. But the physical violation of my personal space was far from over. From the dark corner of the room near the sliding glass door, two more figures emerged from the shadows. Beatrice and Caroline had silently slipped inside while the corrupt doctor and the bribed notary were setting up their fraudulent operation. They had come to eagerly witness the final destruction of my corporate empire. Caroline stepped right up to the left side of my bed, her eyes completely ignoring my bruised and bandaged face. She did not possess a single ounce of empathy or basic human decency. Her greedy gaze was locked entirely onto my left hand, which rested limply on top of the sterile white hospital blanket. While Bradley was hyper-focused on manipulating my right arm to secure the illegal signature, Caroline saw a golden opportunity to extract her own immediate financial payout. She leaned aggressively over the metal bed rail, her cheap floral perfume mixing unpleasantly with the sharp clinical scent of hospital antiseptic. She reached out and grabbed my left hand. Her fingers were cold and remarkably rough as she callously handled my supposedly paralyzed limb. She did not treat me like a human being who had just survived a catastrophic physical trauma. She treated me like a lifeless mannequin displaying expensive jewelry in a department store window. I watched through my peripheral vision as she aggressively yanked at my left ring finger. She was explicitly targeting the flawless 5-carat diamond wedding band I had purchased entirely for myself when Bradley claimed his startup funds were tied up and he could not afford a proper ring. The massive diamond slid off my finger with a sharp, painful scrape against my knuckle. Caroline held the brilliant stone up to the dim hospital lighting, a look of pure, unadulterated avarice washing over her features. She quickly shoved the $1 million ring deep into the pocket of her designer jacket, but her blatant theft did not stop there. She immediately turned her undivided attention to my wrist, eyeing the custom platinum Rolex watch I wore daily. The watch was a milestone gift to myself after my wealth management firm successfully secured its very first billion-dollar portfolio. Caroline fumbled greedily with the intricate platinum clasp. Her sharp nails dug harshly into my sensitive skin, leaving angry red half-moons along my wrist. I forcefully suppressed the intense burning urge to clench my fist and snap her greedy little wrist entirely in half. The nerves in my left arm were fully active, surging with hot electricity and returning strength, but I forced the muscles to remain completely flaccid. I let my arm flop uselessly against the mattress as she finally unhooked the heavy timepiece. "You are bedridden anyway," Caroline whispered directly into my ear, her tone dripping with fake sympathy that barely concealed her malicious delight. "You will not be needing any of this heavy jewelry in the nursing home. Let me hold on to these for you so they do not get lost in the hospital laundry." She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and strapped my platinum watch firmly onto her own wrist. She admired the expensive metal against her skin, completely detached from the horrific reality of what she had just done. She was actively robbing a paralyzed woman on her supposed deathbed, and she felt absolutely zero remorse. My internal rage burned hotter than a dying star, but I kept my facial muscles perfectly slack and my eyes locked forward. Every stolen item was simply another massive felony charge I was going to gladly add to her federal indictment. Kendrick hidden eye tracker was flawlessly recording every single second of her brazen robbery in high definition. On the right side of the bed, Bradley completely ignored his sister's criminal behavior. His entire existence was focused entirely on the bright red ink pad resting on the tray table. The corrupt notary had specifically requested red ink for the thumbprint to ensure the unique ridges of the fingerprint would scan perfectly into the digital banking system without blending into the black text of the legal documents. Bradley gripped my right index finger with brutal, unforgiving force. He shoved the sensitive pad of my thumb deep into the bright red sponge coating my flesh in the thick, sticky crimson dye. "This is it," Bradley breathed heavily, a crazed, desperate anticipation radiating from his entire body. "Say goodbye to your precious company, Madison." He dragged my hand violently away from the ink pad and slammed my thumb forcefully onto the final signature line of the massive corporate transfer contract. He pressed down so incredibly hard I could feel my bone grinding against the hard plastic of the tray table. He held it there for 3 agonizing seconds, ensuring the print was absolutely flawless. When he finally pulled my hand away, a stark, bright red fingerprint remained permanently etched onto the heavy parchment paper like a drop of fresh blood. It was officially done. The fraudulent document was completely executed. Mr. Finch quickly snatched the paper, applied his official notary seal with a loud, definitive crunch, and slid the entire portfolio back into his worn leather briefcase. Dr. Gallagher simply nodded, packed up his useless penlight, and slipped out the hospital door without saying a single word. They had delivered the final blow and collected their illicit payouts. The exact moment the heavy door clicked shut behind the corrupt professionals, the quiet hospital room erupted into a grotesque, sickening celebration. Bradley snatched the finalized transfer confirmation copy from the table. He threw his head back and let out a loud, maniacal laugh that bounced sharply off the acoustic ceiling tiles. The sound was purely unhinged, the manic relief of a desperate criminal who truly believed he had just narrowly escaped a brutal execution by the underground syndicate. "We did it!" Bradley shouted, waving the paper in the air like a winning lottery ticket. "I own absolutely everything." Absolutely. Beatrice rushed forward from the dark shadows, her face beaming with malicious, greedy pride. She threw her arms tightly around her son, hugging him fiercely. "You are brilliant, Bradley," she praised him loudly, her voice filled with toxic adoration. "I always knew you would take exactly what this family deserves." Caroline rushed around the foot of the hospital bed and eagerly joined the group, embraced the shiny platinum of my stolen watch, catching the harsh fluorescent light as she threw her arms around her brother and her mother. The 3 of them jumped and cheered, laughing hysterically right in the center of the intensive care unit. They were celebrating their absolute victory right in front of my face. They danced around my hospital bed, completely ignoring the woman they fully believed they had permanently destroyed. I lay absolutely motionless, the bright red ink drying slowly on my thumb. I watched my husband, my mother-in-law, and my sister-in-law revel in their horrific, unforgivable crimes. They thought the red fingerprint symbolized my total, unconditional surrender. They had absolutely no idea it was actually the ultimate inescapable seal on their impending federal prison sentences. Let them laugh. Let them celebrate. Let them wear my stolen diamonds. Tomorrow morning, when the federal authorities kicked down their doors, the look of absolute soul-crushing terror on their faces was going to be worth every single second of this agonizing charade. The celebration in the sterile intensive care unit died down as Bradley shifted his focus entirely to the digital heist. He practically shoved his mother and sister out of the way, grabbing his sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase. He slapped the computer down onto the small rolling tray table right next to the bright red ink pad he had just used to brand my thumb. His fingers flew across the keyboard with frantic, desperate energy. The syndicate deadline was a loaded gun pointed directly at his head, and he needed that $10 million routed to his offshore accounts before the morning sun breached the city skyline. I kept my breathing perfectly shallow, my eyes locked in a vacant stare. From my peripheral vision, I watched him open a secure encrypted video conferencing application. He was bypassing the standard customer service channels and connecting directly to the elite 24-hour emergency liaison desk at my primary investment bank. This was a dedicated line reserved exclusively for high-net-worth clients facing catastrophic financial events. The video call connected with a sharp digital chime. A sharply dressed bank executive appeared on the screen, sitting in a brightly lit office despite the late hour. His nameplate identified him as Director Montgomery. He adjusted his glasses, looking at Bradley with a mixture of professional courtesy and mild confusion. Good evening, Mr. Hayes. We received your emergency notification. How can the Private Wealth Division assist you tonight? Bradley immediately adopted his sickeningly perfect persona. He slumped his shoulders, forcing his voice to sound hoarse and trembling with fabricated sorrow. Director Montgomery, I am calling from the intensive care unit. My wife Madison suffered a catastrophic spinal injury this evening. The top neurologists have just officially declared her permanently incapacitated. It is an absolute nightmare. Director Montgomery's face fell into an expression of genuine corporate sympathy. I am so incredibly sorry to hear that, sir. Madison is one of our most valued clients. Please tell me what we can do to support you during this horrific time. Bradley wasted zero time. He snatched the freshly stamped contract from the bed and held it directly up to the laptop camera. The bright red fingerprint was displayed prominently on the screen. I have a legally binding, fully notarized power of attorney and a complete corporate transfer agreement, Bradley stated, his tone shifting from grieving husband to aggressive corporate dictator. I am assuming total executive control of her wealth management firm and all personal liquid assets immediately. I am transmitting the high-resolution digital scans to your secure portal right now. He hit a key on his laptop, sending the fraudulent files through the banking interface. I need you to authorize an immediate emergency wire transfer of $10 million to my designated holding account, Bradley commanded. The firm is facing massive market exposure due to the news of her accident. I must secure this capital immediately to stabilize the portfolios and cover her impending experimental medical treatments. I lay paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was so incredibly arrogant. He genuinely believed that a stamped piece of paper and a sad story would force a major financial institution to hand over $10 million in the middle of the night. Director Montgomery hesitated, his eyes scanning the documents that had just popped up on his end of the system. Sir, this is an incredibly large sum to move outside of normal operating hours. Standard protocol requires a 24-hour verification period for a transfer of this magnitude, especially involving a sudden change in executive power. I do not have 24 hours, Bradley roared, slamming his fist onto the tray table. The sudden violence made the laptop shake. You are looking at a legally executed document verified by a licensed medical professional and a state notary. If you do not process this transfer right this very second, I will hold you personally liable for the financial collapse of her firm. I will sue this bank into absolute oblivion. Do your job and release my money. Beatrice stepped into the frame, leaning over her son's shoulder. She glared fiercely into the camera. We are dealing with a massive family tragedy, and you are playing bureaucratic games with my daughter-in-law medical fund. Beatrice hissed. Transfer the money immediately, or I will make sure the press knows exactly how this bank treats grieving families. Faced with the threat of a massive lawsuit and public relations disaster, Director Montgomery finally caved. I understand the urgency, sir. Please give me one moment. I am overriding the standard holding protocol and initiating the executive transfer right now. Bradley let out a ragged breath of victory. He turned his laptop screen slightly so he could watch the banking portal interface load. Through the tiny lens of the eye tracker hidden on my oxygen tube, I had a perfect high-definition view of his computer screen. The bank's secure dashboard displayed a large green progress bar. The $10 million wire transfer was officially pending. The bar began to fill, inching slowly from 10% to 40%. Bradley leaned closer to the screen, his eyes wide, completely mesmerized by the digital representation of his stolen fortune. 50%, 70%. He was practically vibrating with malicious joy. He turned to look at me, a disgusting, victorious sneer twisting his features. He thought he had completely won. He thought he had beaten me, beaten my lawyers, and secured his escape from the dangerous criminal syndicate. 85%. 95%. Then the entire digital world abruptly stopped. The smooth green progress bar instantly froze on the screen. The quiet hum of the laptop fan seemed to amplify in the sudden, terrifying silence. Bradley frowned, clicking his mouse frantically. "Process, you stupid machine," he muttered under his breath, tapping the glass trackpad with increasing aggression. Suddenly, the sleek professional banking interface vanished entirely. The screen flashed violently, turning a blinding, stark, aggressive shade of crimson red. A massive warning box exploded across the center of the display, the bold white letters screaming an undeniable catastrophic message. "Fraud alert! Federal investigation active. All assets seized by United States government authority." The loud, harsh error chime blasted from the laptop speakers, echoing through the intensive care unit like a digital death sentence. Bradley recoiled from the computer as if it had physically burned him. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered ghost. He stared at the glowing red screen, his mouth opening and closing in absolute horrified disbelief. "What is this?" Bradley screamed into the video call, his voice breaking into a high-pitched shriek of pure panic. "What did you just do to my account? Release the hold right now." On the other side of the call, Director Montgomery looked completely bewildered, his hands raised defensively. "I did not do this, sir." The banker stammered, his eyes darting across his own monitors. "The system just locked me out entirely. This is not a standard bank freeze. This is a direct federal injunction. The system says the Federal Bureau of Investigation has flagged these specific accounts for massive wire fraud and money laundering. I have completely lost access." "You are lying!" Bradley roared, grabbing the laptop and shaking it violently. "I gave you the legal power of attorney. That money belongs to me. Fix it. Fix it right now before I destroy you." "Sir, I have to terminate this call immediately," Director Montgomery said, his professional demeanor entirely replaced by legal self-preservation. "I am required by federal law to report this interaction to the authorities. Do not contact this bank again." The video call abruptly went black, plunging Bradley back to the red glaring error screen. The $10 million he desperately needed to save his own life had vanished into a federal void. The criminal syndicate deadline was still ticking, and he was now holding absolutely nothing but a worthless forged piece of paper. He had not just failed to steal my money. He had just triggered a massive federal investigation, and his digital fingerprints were completely smothered all over the crime scene. Bradley completely lost his mind. He grabbed the heavy hospital tray table and violently hurled it across the room. The metal crashed loudly against the wall, sending the ink pad and the fraudulent contracts scattering across the sterile linoleum floor. He screamed a string of vicious, unintelligible curses, ripping at his expensive hair, finally realizing that his brilliant murderous heist had just become a spectacular, inescapable suicide mission. The deafening crash of the metal tray table against the wall left a ringing echo in the intensive care unit. The scattered papers and the overturned red ink pad stained the pristine linoleum floor like a fresh crime scene. Bradley stood hyperventilating in the center of the wreckage. His perfectly tailored suit was rumpled, his face a mask of absolute terror and unhinged fury. The glowing red federal warning on his laptop screen cast a sinister hue across his pale features. He had just witnessed his $10 million lifeline evaporate into thin air. Beatrice and Caroline stood frozen in the shadows, their premature celebration completely extinguished. The incredibly sudden shift from triumphant, arrogant victory to absolute catastrophic failure left them both completely and utterly speechless. Caroline instinctively pulled her sleeve down to cover the stolen platinum watch on her wrist, while Beatrice clutched her expensive wrap tightly around her shoulders. They could sense the immense danger closing in around them, but they had absolutely no idea how massive the impending storm was about to be. I maintained my perfectly rigid posture on the hospital mattress. My eyes remained fixed on the acoustic ceiling tiles projecting the illusion of a brain-dead victim. But beneath the thick cotton blankets, the adrenaline pumping through my recovering nervous system was electric. My right hand was fully clenched into a tight fist. I was now more than ready for the ultimate grand finale. The sliding glass doors of my private medical suite did not simply open. They were violently forced apart with a loud, aggressive slam that made the entire doorframe shudder. The sheer physical force of the entry sucked the sterile air right out of the room. Bradley jumped out of his skin, spinning around to face the corridor. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, instinctively backing up against the wall. Harrison Cole strode into the intensive care unit with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. The silver-haired corporate attorney did not wear his usual mask of polite legal professionalism. His face was set in a ruthless predatory glare that promised absolute destruction. He was not alone. Marching directly behind him was the chief of the local police department, fully uniformed, his hand resting casually but purposefully on his utility belt. Flanking the police chief were two individuals wearing crisp, dark suits and windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs. Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agents. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, their eyes scanning the chaotic room and immediately identifying every single threat. The sheer display of supreme legal and federal authority entirely consumed the small medical suite. The air grew instantly thick and suffocating. Bradley took a frantic step backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the scattered documents he had just hurled across the floor. He looked at the local police, then at the federal agents, and finally at Harrison Cole. The reality of his situation was crashing down upon him, but his narcissistic delusion refused to let him surrender quietly. Bradley scrambled desperately on his hands and knees, frantically grabbing the scattered pages of the corporate transfer agreement from the dirty linoleum. He snatched the final page, the one bearing the bright red imprint of my thumb, and shot back up to his feet. He held the document out in front of him like a fragile shield, pointing a trembling finger at Harrison. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and manufactured outrage. "You have absolutely no right to barge into my wife's private medical suite. I am the legal head of her estate. I am the acting chief executive officer of her firm. You are officially trespassing here, Harrison. Get out of this hospital right now before I have every single one of you sued for harassment." Harrison did not even blink. He stopped at the foot of my bed, folding his arms across his tailored suit, watching my husband unravel with cold, clinical satisfaction. "Look at this!" Bradley roared violently, shaking the paper in the air so the federal agents could see the red ink. "This is a fully notarized, legally binding transfer of ownership. My wife just gave me total executive control. She signed over 100% of her corporate shares and personal assets to me. I brought a licensed medical consultant and a state notary into this room to verify her cognitive state. She is completely paralyzed physically, but she understood exactly what she was doing. She pressed her own thumb onto this signature line to save her company from market volatility. I am the sole legitimate owner of everything. You cannot touch me. You cannot freeze my accounts." He was panting heavily, his eyes darting frantically between the unmoving faces of the law enforcement officers. He expected the highly trained badge-carrying authorities to respect the legal weight of a fully notarized contract. He was desperately clinging to the illusion that his red ink pad and his bribed officials had outsmarted the federal government. The two FBI special agents did not say a single word. They simply exchanged a brief, highly trained glance before moving into action. With terrifying synchronized fluidity, they stepped forward and positioned themselves directly in front of the heavy glass doors, entirely blocking the only exit from the intensive care unit. They stood perfectly shoulder to shoulder, their postures extremely rigid and totally uncompromising, forming an impenetrable human wall. The local police chief moved deliberately toward the dark corner of the room, where Beatrice and Caroline were currently cowering. He placed himself firmly between the two terrified women and the hallway, effectively cutting off any potential escape route. He rested his hand near his radio, his gaze locked intensely on the mother and daughter who had conspired to loot my body. They were entirely surrounded. The steel trap had finally slammed completely shut, and they were caught dead inside. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Bradley held the fraudulent contract out in front of him, his hand shaking violently as the bright red ink of my thumbprint practically glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rapid, terrified spasms. He desperately wanted Harrison Cole to look at that red mark and concede defeat. He wanted the federal agents to recognize his manufactured legal authority and back away. Harrison Cole did not back away. He did not look intimidated, and he certainly did not look defeated. Instead, a slow, freezing smile spread across the veteran attorney face. It was a terrifying smile, the look of a seasoned apex predator who had just watched his prey walk willingly into a steel cage and lock the door from the inside. Harrison calmly reached into his own tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek pair of reading glasses. He slipped them on, stepping right up to the edge of my hospital bed. He looked down at the crumpled, blood-red document shaking in my husband's grasp, and then he let out a short, sharp laugh that cut through the tension like a razor blade. "You can go ahead and tear that pathetic piece of paper into confetti." Bradley Harrison stated, his voice echoing with supreme, lethal authority. "You can burn it. You can eat it. You can frame it and hang it on the wall of your prison cell. Because that document is absolutely, unequivocally, and completely worthless." Bradley froze, his eyes widening in pure confusion. "What are you talking about?" he stammered aggressively, thrusting the paper forward again. "This is a notarized transfer of personal assets. She signed over everything. I have the medical declaration. It is fully legal in this state." Harrison slowly reached into his heavy leather briefcase. He did not pull out a single sheet of paper. He pulled out a massive leather-bound binder that must have weighed 5 pounds. He tossed it casually onto the foot of my hospital bed. The heavy binder landed right on top of my legs with a loud, definitive thud. 3 months ago, Harrison began pacing slowly at the foot of my bed, like a professor addressing a severely failing student. Madison and I sat down to completely restructure her entire financial and corporate portfolio. She explicitly instructed me to build an impenetrable fortress around her lifework. So we established a highly aggressive, irrevocable entity known as a revocable living trust. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp from the dark corner of the room, her hands flying to her mouth. She was a suburban socialite who spent her days gossiping at country clubs, but even she understood the terrifying legal implications of a living trust. Bradley, however, was a superficial amateur, playing a high-stakes game he entirely failed to comprehend. "I am the sole legally appointed trustee of that entity." Harrison continued, his voice rising in volume and power. "Do you know what that means, Bradley? It means that the wealth management firm does not belong to Madison anymore. The sprawling Connecticut mansion you currently live in does not belong to Madison. The massive investment portfolios, the liquid cash reserves, the commercial real estate holdings, none of it is registered under her individual name. Every single asset she spent her life building was legally and permanently transferred into the ownership of the trust exactly 90 days ago." Bradley's face drained of all remaining color, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The red-inked contract in his hand suddenly began to tremble uncontrollably. "A standard power of attorney only grants you control over assets held in a person's individual name," Harrison explained, twisting the knife with cold, clinical precision. "And since Madison's individual net worth currently consists of a few personal checking accounts and the ruined dress she was wearing when you pushed her down the stairs, your grand midnight heist has netted you absolutely zero corporate authority. You cannot transfer assets she does not personally own. You cannot liquidate a company she does not personally possess. You are lying!" Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail of denial. "You are making this up to protect her. She is my wife. I have marital rights to that company." Harrison stepped right into Bradley's personal space, towering over him with terrifying menace. "Marital rights do not pierce a properly structured corporate trust, you arrogant fool," Harrison growled. "Especially when the spouse is explicitly and legally excluded from the beneficiary matrix, which you absolutely are. You brought a corrupt doctor and a bribed notary into a federal medical facility. You physically assaulted a paralyzed woman to force her thumbprint onto a personal transfer agreement. And you did it all to steal an empty vault. The sheer monumental weight of his failure crashed down onto Bradley's shoulders. His knees buckled slightly. The red stamped paper slipped from his sweaty fingers, fluttering aimlessly to the dirty hospital floor. He had risked everything. He had orchestrated a brutal attempted murder. He had committed multiple counts of federal fraud. He had exposed himself to the terrifying wrath of the criminal syndicate hunting him down. And he had done it all for a completely useless, legally void piece of paper. Beatrice let out a loud, agonizing wail from the corner of the room. She realized instantly that the luxurious mansion she had planned to steal was never going to be hers. The endless shopping sprees funded by my corporate accounts were permanently canceled. She was going to end up exactly where she belonged, utterly destitute, and facing major federal conspiracy charges alongside her pathetic son. Caroline backed further into the wall, her eyes darting nervously toward the stolen platinum watch secured tightly around her own wrist. She suddenly realized that stolen piece of jewelry was likely the only physical asset they had managed to successfully extract from me, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents were blocking the only exit. I lay perfectly still under the hospital blankets, feeling the heavy grounding weight of the massive trust document resting on my legs. The sheer, overwhelming ecstasy of absolute victory roared through my mind. Bradley had spent our entire marriage underestimating my intelligence. He assumed I was just a naive woman, desperate for his affection, completely blind to his parasitic greed. He never realized that I was a financial predator who always stayed 10 steps ahead of my enemies. He was completely broken. His spirit was shattered, his fake empire obliterated, and his future entirely erased by his own profound ignorance of corporate law. The stage was set perfectly. The audience of federal agents and legal titans was completely captivated by his spectacular downfall. It was finally time for the main event. It was time for the paralyzed, brain-dead victim he so deeply despised to personally deliver the absolute final blow. The revelation of the living trust hung in the stagnant hospital air like a suffocating blanket of solid lead. Bradley remained frozen on his knees, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the crumpled, useless transfer document resting near his expensive leather shoes. The entire foundation of his murderous plot had just been utterly vaporized by a single leather binder. Beatrice pressed her back against the cold wall, her hands trembling violently as she finally comprehended the terrifying reality of federal prison. Caroline stood completely paralyzed, her greedy fingers subconsciously tracing the stolen platinum watch on her wrist, suddenly realizing it was no longer a trophy, but a highly incriminating piece of evidence. The local police chief and the 2 Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents maintained their impenetrable wall at the door, their expressions carved from absolute stone. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to execute a meticulously planned takedown. Harrison Cole adjusted his suit jacket, his sharp gaze shifting from the defeated husband on the floor to my supposedly lifeless form on the bed. The stage was perfectly set. The predators had been entirely disarmed and stripped of their legal armor. It was time for the ultimate resurrection. For days I had existed as a ghost trapped inside my own flesh. I had endured the excruciating indignity of being handled, mocked, and violated by the people who were supposed to be my family. I had listened to them gleefully orchestrate my financial ruin and plan my permanent exile to a miserable nursing facility. I had felt the agonizing pressure of my husband crushing my thumb into a bright red ink pad to steal my empire. Now the overwhelming surge of adrenaline pumping through my fully recovered nervous system demanded absolute release. I focused all my fierce accumulated rage into my right hand, the very same hand Bradley had violently manipulated just minutes ago. Slowly, deliberately, I flexed my fingers. I formed a tight, powerful fist, the joints cracking loudly in the dead silence of the intensive care unit. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot. Bradley Head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto my hand. His jaw dropped open in a silent, horrified scream. He watched in absolute disbelief as I lifted my right arm smoothly off the sterile mattress, completely defying the catastrophic medical diagnosis he had banked his entire miserable life on. A collective breathless gasp erupted from the dark corner of the room where Beatrice and Caroline were cowering. They stared at me as if they were witnessing a corpse rise from the morgue table. Beatrice's legs gave out, causing her to slide down the wall until she hit the floor, her hands gripping her hair in sheer panic. I brought my hand up to my face with calm, terrifying precision. I grabbed the clear plastic tubing of the supplemental oxygen cannula, wrapped around my ears, and aggressively yanked it away from my nose. I tossed the useless medical equipment onto the metal tray table. Next, I reached for the rigid, suffocating cervical collar locked tightly around my throat. I dug my fingers under the heavy straps. The loud, tearing sound of the thick Velcro ripping apart sliced through the quiet hospital suite. It was the beautiful sound of my absolute liberation. I pulled the heavy plastic brace away from my neck and casually dropped it off the side of the bed. It clattered loudly against the linoleum floor, landing right next to Bradley's trembling knees. Then, planting my hands firmly against the mattress, I engaged my core and pushed myself upward. My spine, completely healed from the temporary swelling, supported my weight flawlessly. I swung my legs over the edge of the hospital bed, sitting up perfectly straight. I rolled my shoulders backwards, stretching the stiff muscles, and looked directly down at the pathetic broken man kneeling on the floor. Bradley looked up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He was not looking at a vulnerable, paralyzed wife anymore. He was staring straight into the eyes of a ruthless corporate executioner. His lips moved frantically, trying to form words, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The arrogant tech bro who had confidently choreographed my murder was now reduced to a trembling, incoherent mess. I let him suffer in that agonizing silence for a long moment before I finally spoke. My voice was slightly raspy from days of disuse, but it rang with undeniable, freezing authority. The attending physician officially informed me that my spinal shock ended exactly 3 days ago, I stated, looking down at him with supreme disgust. I regained my full motor functions within 48 hours of your pathetic attempt to murder me on our driveway. I was never in a permanent vegetative state. The shock on his face deepened into absolute soul-crushing despair. You were awake, he choked out, his voice barely a raspy whisper. You heard everything. I heard every single word. I confirmed, my tone dripping with lethal satisfaction. I heard you complain about hitting me too hard. I heard you and your mother plan to lock me in a state-funded facility. I heard you brag about disabling the security cameras. I just lay perfectly still in this bed to see exactly how far you and your greedy family would go with this disgusting charade. I needed to keep you entirely comfortable so you would confidently bring those fraudulent documents right into this room. I stayed paralyzed to gather enough irrefutable high-definition evidence to constitute the severe federal crime of forced contract signing, extortion, and attempted murder. Bradley's entire reality imploded. The devastating realization that he had been expertly played, manipulated, and trapped by the very woman he tried to kill completely destroyed his mind. He realized that every cruel confession, every forged signature, and every threatening phone call had been meticulously monitored and recorded. He let out a gut-wrenching hollow groan that sounded like a dying animal. His arms gave out beneath him, and he collapsed completely onto the dirty hospital floor, burying his face against the cold linoleum as the crushing weight of his permanent destruction finally broke him. The crushing silence in the intensive care unit was broken by the sound of deliberate, heavy footsteps approaching from the corridor. The two Federal Bureau of Investigation agents stepped aside just enough to allow one more person into the crowded suite. Kendrick strode into the room, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, carrying a sleek black garment bag over his arm and holding a small digital remote control in his right hand. He did not spare a single glance for the pathetic, sobbing man on the floor or the two terrified women cowering in the corner. He walked directly to the large, flat-screen television mounted on the hospital wall, plugging a small encrypted flash drive into the side port. I think the federal authorities need to see the main feature presentation, Kendrick announced, his deep voice commanding absolute attention. He pressed a button on the remote, and the screen instantly flickered to life. The high-definition footage from my hidden independent cellular camera began to play in brilliant clarity. The entire room watched in utter horrified silence as the digital projection showed Bradley walking onto the marble driveway hours before his birthday party. The federal agents stepped closer to the screen, their eyes narrowing as they witnessed my husband pull out a metal tin of industrial-grade polishing wax. They watched him drop to his knees and meticulously aggressively rub the slick compound onto the sharpest edge of the top marble stair. They watched him pantomime my exact backward fall, physically calculating the lethal trajectory to ensure maximum catastrophic damage to my cervical spine. The undeniable, chilling reality of his premeditated violence was broadcast for everyone to see. This was the ultimate smoking gun. That is enough. The lead federal agent stated, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. He turned away from the television screen and looked directly at the local police chief. "Take him down." Two heavily armed local police officers immediately moved in. They hauled Bradley up from the dirty linoleum floor, violently twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room. "Bradley Hayes, you are under arrest for attempted murder." In the first degree, the police chief declared, reading him his rights with cold precision. The federal agent stepped right up to Bradley, terrified, tear-streaked face. "And the Federal Bureau of Investigation is officially charging you with multiple counts of federal wire fraud for soliciting $1 million across state lines using a fraudulent medical crowdfunding campaign. You are going to be locked in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life." Bradley thrashed against the officers, screaming incoherently, begging for mercy, but his pathetic cries fell on completely deaf ears. They dragged him violently toward the doorway. Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical shriek and tried to lunge after her son, but the second federal agent swiftly grabbed her by the shoulder and slammed her back against the wall. "Beatrice Hayes, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to federal wire fraud," the agent barked, pulling out a second pair of steel handcuffs. Beatrice wailed in absolute agony, screaming about her social standing, crying that a woman of her immense suburban prestige could not possibly survive in a county jail. The officers ignored her desperate, arrogant pleas, locking the cuffs tightly around her wrists and marching her aggressively out of the medical suite. In the dark corner of the room, Caroline was physically vibrating with pure, unadulterated terror. She watched her brother and her mother get hauled away in chains. She looked down at her own trembling hands, suddenly hyper-aware of the stolen jewelry burning against her skin. She desperately grabbed the platinum watch and the 5-carat diamond ring, ripping them off her wrist and finger with frantic, shaking movements. She stumbled forward, her face completely drenched in tears, holding the stolen items out toward me. "I am so sorry," Caroline sobbed hysterically, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I was just holding them. I swear I was just keeping them safe. Please do not let them arrest me. I am your family." Kendrick stepped directly into her path, his tall, imposing frame completely blocking her from reaching my bed. "You are a disgusting, greedy thief," Kendrick stated, looking down at his wife with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "And you are no longer my family." Female police officers stepped up behind Caroline, firmly grabbing her arms and slapping a third pair of handcuffs onto her wrists. "Caroline Hayes, you are under arrest for grand larceny and possession of stolen property," the officer announced, dragging the weeping, completely broken woman out of the room to join her mother and brother in the waiting patrol cars. The intensive care unit suddenly felt incredibly spacious and wonderfully quiet. The toxic parasitic infection that had plagued my entire life had just been surgically and permanently removed. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, undeniable taste of absolute victory. I swung my legs entirely off the hospital bed and planted my bare feet firmly on the cold linoleum floor. I stood up to my full height, my spine perfectly straight, my recovering muscles humming with powerful, renewed energy. Kendrick walked over and handed me the black garment bag he had brought from my home. I stepped into the private hospital bathroom, stripping off the degrading, sterile medical gown. I pulled on the crisp, tailored charcoal power suit Kendrick had retrieved from my executive closet. I buttoned the jacket, adjusted the collar, and looked at myself in the mirror. I was no longer a victim. I was an apex predator. I walked back into the main room, projecting the fierce, unstoppable aura of a woman who had just conquered death itself. Harrison Cole and Kendrick stood waiting for me, their expressions radiating immense pride and profound respect. Kendrick handed me a sleek digital tablet. The screen displayed the highly encrypted network, routing the massive debts Bradley owed to the violent underground criminal syndicate. Bradley had desperately hoped the fraudulent crowdfunding money would save him from their wrath. I tapped the screen, authorizing a permanent, irreversible digital lockdown on every single one of his hidden crypto accounts. I completely severed his access to any potential hidden funds, ensuring he was entirely defenseless. "Let the syndicate deal with him while he rots in a federal holding cell," I stated coldly, handing the tablet back to my brilliant brother-in-law. He dug his own grave. Now he gets to lie in it. I turned to face the large glass windows, watching the red and blue police lights flashing against the dark city sky as the patrol cars carried my traitorous husband and his greedy family away forever. The storm had finally passed, and my empire was completely secure. I turned back to look at my two greatest allies, my trusted corporate attorney and the brilliant cybersecurity expert who had saved my life. Cancel the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign and refund every single donor, I commanded, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. Then contact the major financial networks and prepare a global press conference for tomorrow morning. The chief executive officer has officially returned to work. The harrowing journey we just witnessed teaches us a profound and unforgettable lesson about trust, resilience, and the true definition of family. When you build your life from the ground up, pouring your blood, sweat, and tears into your success, you must fiercely protect what you have earned. We are often taught to blindly trust those we marry and the families we marry into. But this story is a chilling reminder that legal ties do not automatically guarantee loyalty. True security does not just come from accumulating wealth. It comes from having the foresight to protect yourself legally and financially from those who might seek to exploit your vulnerability. Madison survived not because of a miracle, but because she was always 10 steps ahead of her predators. She secured her massive empire with an ironclad living trust and surrounded herself with brilliant allies who valued her for her mind and character, not just her bank account. People like Harrison Cole and Kendrick proved that real family is chosen based on integrity and unwavering support during your darkest and most terrifying hours. Furthermore, this story proves that your humble beginnings do not define your ultimate limitations. The exact same resilience that pulled Madison out of crushing poverty gave her the immense psychological strength to lie paralyzed and wait for the perfect moment to strike back at her abusers. She did not let her trauma break her. Instead, she used it as a weapon to completely destroy the people who tried to bury her. The ultimate revenge is not just seeing your enemies face severe federal justice, but rising from the ashes to reclaim your power completely unbroken. You must never let anyone dim your light or steal the beautiful empire you have built with your own two hands. If you found this incredible journey of resilience and ultimate justice inspiring, please hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories of survival.